Chapter 1 of The Man with the Black Cord. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. Leopold Erlach disappears. The little hamlet of Inzerdorf, near Vienna, enjoyed the melancholy distinction of being one of the very few spots in the vicinity of the Austrian capital which did not lay claim to natural beauty. The dusty, straggling little village existed mainly for the sake of the great brickworks, which were its chief industry. There were few people in Inzerdorf living there from choice. Almost everybody had something to do with the brickworks or with the official administration of the village. But here and there on the dreary expanse of open fields and moors lay the oasis of a private garden or small park, surrounding its dwelling-house, and in its turn hidden from the passers-by on the high roads by tall brick walls. Among these homes of greater ease, the Erlach mansion was one of the oldest and best known. The house itself, imposing in structure in spite of its 1.5 stories only in height, was of the solid build of a former century, and had its every door and window guarded by heavy iron bars. The slow growth of many years had enwrapped the severity of its exterior in a mass of rich-toned green, 6 different clinging plants striving for a place there. This rather unusual completeness of nature's encroachment gave the building the popular name of the greenhouse. Mr. Leopold Erlach, the owner of this attractive property, was neither popular nor gregarious. Few visitors passed the heavy gates in the high brick wall that enclosed the pleasant, well-kept garden with its wealth of flower beds under spreading trees. On a bright September morning, warm even for the season, although following a night of storm, the greenhouse dozed in its customary quiet. The gardener moved silently about the grounds at his task of gathering up the leaves and twigs torn down by the night wind. Within the kitchen, Mrs. Teresa Tunner, Mr. Erlach's cook and housekeeper, stood at the table preparing her master's breakfast tray. Her movements were slow and heavy, and the expression of her worn and haggard face, which yet gave evidences of refinement beyond her station, was more than usually distraught and uneasy. She caught herself 2 or 3 times in little forgetfulnesses of the daily routine, even in such a simple matter as preparing the breakfast, and it took a visible effort for her to pull herself together. She was well aware of the fact that any carelessness coming to Mr. Erlach's notice might cost her her place, for this elderly bachelor was a very particular and exacting employer, and there were many changes in his household force. The few people who had occasion to observe it were rather surprised that a woman of so sensitive a nature as Mrs. Tunner could have endured his eccentricities for nearly 2 years. When the tray was finally ready and carried into the dining room, Mrs. Tunner was relieved to find that Mr. Erlach was not already seated there, as was his usual custom. It gave her time to cast a last glance around and to see whether everything was in order. Then she returned to her own room, which lay between the kitchen and the dining room, and through which she had to pass when going to and fro between these rooms. She left the door into the dining room open that she might hear Mr. Erlach when he came out from his own bedchamber. Mrs. Tunner sank down into a chair, and her eyes, full of dreary despair, glanced abstractedly about the neat little apartment. Suddenly she started. A quick flush mounted to her faded cheeks, and she sprang from her seat. She had caught sight of a bright-colored piece of silk, a man's neck-muffler, which lay thrown over the arm of the sofa. She snatched it up and threw it into a cupboard drawer, looking about uneasily. Then she relaxed into troubled thought again, until suddenly the realization that Mr. Erlach had not yet entered the dining room penetrated her consciousness. She glanced at the clock and saw that the tray had been standing on the table for 15 minutes. She rose, took the hot milk and the coffee back to the kitchen and put them on the stove. Then she went to her own room again, but a feeling of growing unease would not let her rest. Such a change in her employer's methodical habits was unprecedented. Mrs. Tunner walked slowly into the dining room and stood there waiting and listening for some noise from her master's apartment. In the utter stillness of the heavy-walled house, her own breath seemed to stop, as she stood there with her hands pressed to her heart. Then, as if driven by some impulse she could not understand, the woman moved forward slowly until she found herself in the hall in front of the bedroom door. Here she knelt with her ear to the keyhole and listened again. Not a sound. No moving about, not even a breath, came from within. The kneeling woman rose suddenly to her feet and fell back against the door jamb, her face ghastly pale, her lips parted in a gasping sob. Her heart stood still before the sudden horror that had seized it. She controlled herself with an effort and turned the doorknob resolutely. The door was locked on the inside, another most unusual thing. But in spite of its unusualness, this fact seemed to bring relief to Mrs. Tunner's mind. She moved quickly to the next door down the hall, which led into Mr. Erlach's study. This door also was locked on the inside, and again Mrs. Tunner felt a surge of relief roll over her troubled mind. But it was only momentary. The dread came back again, and she beat at the door, rattling the knob and calling her employer's name loudly. No sound came from within the closed rooms. "Oh, what is it? What is the matter? What has happened?" exclaimed the woman. She ran to the front door and found it locked as usual. The outer iron gate was also locked, and the keys of both doors were presumably in their usual place on the little table near Mr. Erlach's bed. The now thoroughly frightened woman hurried back to the dining room and through it and her own room to the kitchen. The straight, broad hall that ran the length of the house was divided 2/3 of its length by a cross wall, so that it was necessary to go through the dining room to reach the kitchen and the back door. As she passed through her own room and also in the kitchen, Mrs. Tunner cast a glance of anxious scrutiny in every corner. Some hideous, unspoken fear lay in her eyes, crushed down by a conscious effort of the will. She paused in the kitchen for a moment and then went to the back door of the house and called to the gardener. Andreas Till, bending over a flower bed, looked up with a start as he heard the woman's voice. For in spite of Mrs. Tunner's effort to control herself, the words came in a tone of agony. "What's the matter?" cried Till, running up to the door. "Mr. Erlach, he hasn't come out of his room. I don't hear him moving about." "Well, what is there to be frightened about in that?" Come to his room." "Did you knock?" "Of course." "Well, come on. Let's see what the matter is." In spite of his bluster, the gardener felt the contagion of Mrs. Tunner's anxiety, and he followed her into the house with a grave face. They knocked and beat at the doors, shook the knobs and called loudly, but still there was no sound from within. Maybe he's gone out," murmured Mrs. Tunner between pale lips. "I've been up since dawn," answered Till. "He's not gone out since then. Anyway, I opened the little gate myself an hour ago, and it was bolted then. He couldn't have bolted it behind him." "But the great gate?" "The iron bar was in its place. The bar that locks it from the inside, you know." As the gardener spoke, he bent to look through the keyhole. He saw a pale glimmer of light within the darkened bedroom, and the stale odor of heated oil came to his nostrils. The little night light by the bedside was still burning. "The key is inside," said Till. "He hasn't left his room." The two looked at each other with an anxious question in their eyes. "I'm going to the factory to get a locksmith to open these doors. I'll ask them to telephone for the doctor, too." With these words, the gardener started on a quick pace back into the kitchen. Mrs. Tunner followed, panting. "You needn't be so frightened," said Till when he saw her face in the bright light. "Old people like that can have a stroke easy, or go off into a fainting fit." Oh, let us pray that it's only a fainting fit," gasped Mrs. Tunner. The gardener shook his head, surprised at the agony in her voice. "Why, you're all shook up. You'd better go over to my house, or I'll send my wife here to you." "Hello, who's that?" he exclaimed as the bell of the back door jangled over their heads. When the gardener had left the room, Mrs. Tunner sank into a chair, and dropping her arms on the table, she buried her face in them, sobbing convulsively. "Oh, thank God, she gasped between her sobs. "Both doors are locked from the inside. No one could get into his room. No one. It must be only that he is ill." When Till and his wife came in a few moments later, they were surprised at this evidence of emotion on the part of the usually silent, reserved woman. "Don't take on so," said the gardener. "We'll have the doctor here soon. Wagner dropped in to see if there was any work for him after the storm, so I sent him over to the brick factory. He's younger and quicker than I am. He ought to find somebody there by this time, and we'll have those doors open in a jiffy." Then the three sat down to wait in a silence broken only by Mrs. Tunner's gasping breath and an occasional murmur of sympathy from little Mrs. Till. The brick factory was less than half a mile distant from the Erlach property, and in a short time the assistant gardener, Wagner, came running up the garden path, followed by a locksmith. The group of frightened servants watched the operation of opening the door and then peered anxiously into the dimly lighted room. The shutters were tight closed on both windows, and the light that fell through the half-open door into the study beyond made a twilight in which the dying flame of the little night lamp flickered pale. The bed was empty. The housekeeper hurried to the windows and threw open the shutters. Then she looked around her. Leopold Erlach was not in his bedroom. Till went through into the sitting room, and in a moment his voice came to the listeners in a note of surprise and fear. "He's not here either." "Not there either?" repeated Mrs. Tunner, bewildered. The locksmith, a young man with an intelligent face, held back Mrs. Till and Faulkner in the corridor. "You stay where you are," he said. "There's something wrong here, and you'd better keep out of it." "It's enough to drive one crazy," said Till, mopping his brow. Mrs. Tunner stood as if dazed, and the gardener had to fairly push her back into the corridor. "You go in and look," he said to the locksmith. "I can't find him. He's gone." "Then I don't see what good my looking can do. I've done all I can. I'm willing to give my testimony about the doors to the constable when he comes." "Oh, yes, we must send for the constable. I don't know what I'm doing. It's all so queer," stammered Till. "Faulkner, you run to the police station. I'd better stay here." Mrs. Till went to the door with Faulkner, while Mrs. Tunner, Till, and the locksmith remained in the room. The gardener brought a chair for Mrs. Tunner, who could hardly hold herself upright. Then they waited in silence while the shadow of suspense and fear sank down over the vine-wrapped house. Chief Constable Kern came himself, and heard the story from the three witnesses. Each had only the same simple facts to tell: all doors locked from the inside, iron bars at all the windows, and yet Mr. Erlach missing. "It's a queer go," said Kern. "Some of those bars at the windows must be looser than they look." The constable entered the bedroom, taking the locksmith with him, while the others at his command remained in the corridor. The bed had evidently been occupied, but looked as if it had been vacated in haste. This was the only sign of disorder, however, and the 2 bunches of keys as well as Mr. Erlach's watch lay undisturbed on the little table by the bed. But there were no clothes to be seen anywhere. The suit and the underwear which he had had on the day before, even his shoes and socks, were missing, as well as the nightshirt which was usually laid ready for him on the bed. In the sitting room everything showed in its usual neatness, for Mr. Erlach was a most orderly old gentleman and exceedingly tidy about all his belongings. One half of one of the high windows stood open, but the iron bars in front of it did not yield even to the pressure of 2 pairs of strong arms. Nothing larger than a cat could slip between these bars, so closely were they set into the window frames. The 2 men examined every cupboard, closet, and corner in either room, every place in which a living man or a dead body might be hidden. There were no signs of Leopold Erlach anywhere, nor any clue to the manner in which he might have escaped, or been carried from his room. "I don't see how it was done," said Kern. "He must have gotten out somehow. He wasn't a wizard." "What's the matter here?" exclaimed a cheerful voice at the door. "Oh, doctor," said the constable, "we don't know what the matter is, unless it's a miracle that's happened." "What did you send for me for, then?" asked Dr. Bergman. "Is Mr. Erlach ill?" "No, sir. He's gone. Nobody knows where or how." Then the constable detailed the case to the physician, his eyes the while following the movements of the locksmith, who was carefully examining the fixtures and bars of all 4 windows. The room was a corner one and had 2 windows each on 2 of its sides. In the other walls, one large door led into the bedroom, while another, a smaller one placed near the corner, opened out into the main corridor. Between this door and the nearest window stood a little table. Something on the table attracted the constable's attention, and he walked over to it, followed by the other 2 men. On the table stood a candlestick holding a half-burned light, the wick of which was pressed down deep into the wax. Spattered drops of grease lay on the tabletop and on the leaves of an open book beside the candlestick. It was a large, old-fashioned volume, a work of ancient history. It was held open by a letter-weight, and 3 words on different parts of the page were underscored in ink. They were scattered words, but they formed a complete sentence. The sentence, "He was here." A few hours later, the official police commission from Liesing, the county seat to which Inzersdorf belonged, had taken possession of the Erlach mansion, and was in official charge of the case. Mrs. Tunner and the gardener and his wife were examined again, but could tell nothing more than what they had told to Constable Kern and the physician. Till was the last member of the household force to have seen Mr. Erlach. As he was passing the study window about 8 o'clock the evening before, his employer called to him, and they had a short conversation about some work to be undertaken in the garden the following day. Mr. Erlach, Till said, looked extremely well and seemed very contented and happy. Then the gardener and the housekeeper were questioned as to any relatives who should be informed of the occurrence. They both asserted that Mr. Erlach had had few intimate friends, and only one relative to their knowledge. This was his nephew, Lieutenant Paul Erlach, who lived in Vienna and occasionally visited his uncle. A telegram was sent to the address given, and about 3 o'clock that afternoon a good-looking and extremely bewildered young officer arrived in Inzersdorf. As he was the next of kin and only representative of the missing man, the police did not dare to undertake the opening of the safe without his presence. Lieutenant Paul Erlach had nothing to say that could throw any light on the mystery. If there was a secret passageway from the room, a passageway which might have been known to the owner of the house, or to whoever it was that had carried him off, his nephew knew nothing about it. He also had very little to say, likewise, from a lack of knowledge, about the missing man's financial standing. Paul Erlach was a frank, sincere nature, and had little in common with his crabbed and eccentric relative. The fact that he was his uncle's sole heir made their association doubly difficult to both. The elder man was of a petty and suspicious nature, and had his nephew given evidence of any affection or interest, Leopold Erlach would doubtless have thought it an intentional flattery. Paul felt this and never came to see his uncle unless by special invitation. He considered himself as of no more importance than any other passing stranger in the house that would one day be his. Therefore, he was not in a position to give any information as to what might or might not be missing from his uncle's safe. The police commissioner opened the heavily barred door, and he and Lieutenant Erlach drew out the various drawers of the safe and examined their contents. The key to the safe had been found in its usual place on Mr. Erlach's key ring by his bedside, and within the safe there was no sign of disturbance or robbery. 4 or 5 of its deep drawers were filled to the brim with fresh new gold pieces of high value. In another compartment were several leather cases containing old-fashioned but costly jewelry. A bitter smile curved the young officer's lips as he saw all this wealth, which his uncle had so carefully kept from his knowledge. Still another compartment of the safe was filled with documents, securities, bonds, and shares, and family papers. Among these last, quite at the bottom of the pile, was one labeled, "My Will." "I wonder when we'll be able to open that," murmured one of the police officials. The money, jewelry, and documents were placed in a suitcase, which was closed and sealed in the presence of the police commissioner and Lieutenant Erlach. Then, after another thorough examination, Mr. Erlach's 2 rooms were also officially closed. Mrs. Tunner informed the police commissioner that she did not care to remain another night in the house, with its gruesome mystery. The official told her that no objections would be made to her departure, but that she must inform him as to her future address. He gave a sharp glance into her troubled eyes. Then, as she left the room, he motioned to one of his men to follow her. He also told Till to delay the woman's departure until evening by any means that would not arouse her suspicion. The gardener promised this, saying he would inform Mrs. Tunner that it was impossible for him to take her trunk to the station until a late afternoon train. "I wonder why," thought the gardener to himself. In the 2 years of their living in the same establishment, neither Till nor his wife had become really acquainted with Mrs. Tunner. The woman's embittered reserve was calculated to arouse suspicion, but Till was a good soul, and did not think it necessary to make any remarks to others about what might interest him. When she had packed her trunk, Mrs. Tunner went over to the gardener's house to wait until he should be ready to accompany her to the railway station. Mrs. Till bustled about hospitably, preparing the supper. Mrs. Tunner had just drawn up her chair to the table when suddenly her face flushed, and she started up, taking a step or 2 in the direction of the door. "What's the matter? Have you forgotten anything? Or is it something you wanted to say to the police?" Mrs. Tunner shook her head, controlled herself, and sat down at the table again. She tried to eat, but it was only by a severe effort that she could force herself to swallow anything. "I wonder what's the matter with her," thought Till again. "She's not the scary kind. This thing shouldn't upset her so. What makes her so excited?" But he said nothing to the police, for his good heart refused to let him add to the troubles of this woman, whose unhappiness and distress were so evident. When the time for the evening train approached, they walked to the station in silence, Till pushing the trunk on a wheelbarrow. When Mrs. Tunner entered the train, a man who had been sauntering up and down the platform stepped into the compartment after her. Till recognized him as one of the plainclothes men who had come that afternoon from the police station, while Mrs. Tunner was in the gardener's house. Mrs. Tunner herself did not notice that she was being followed, so engrossed was she in the gloomy cloud of her own thoughts. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Mother's Fear. A week had passed since the disappearance of Leopold Erlach, and still the clouds of mystery hung black over the occurrence in the greenhouse. The local authorities seemed powerless to unravel the riddle. A thorough and careful search had been made of the premises and the entire vicinity, but Leopold Erlach, living or dead, was not to be found. Nor was there any clue as to how he could have disappeared from the locked room. No arrests were made, as there was no charge upon which to rest suspicion. The occurrence was the talk of Inzersdorf and the neighboring towns, and the Viennese papers gave considerable prominence to it as the mystery thickened. One chill, wet evening, a week after Mr. Erlach's disappearance, Theresa Tunner came hastily down the stairs and out of the door of a tall tenement house in a poor quarter of Vienna. She glanced furtively about her in the hallway and at the door, and seemed relieved as she saw how empty was the ill-lighted street. Mrs. Tunner's face was gray, and the glance of her weary, reddened eyes wavered as she drew her shawl closely around her and hurried along in the shadow of the houses. The woman looked old and haggard, crushed by some overpowering grief or anxiety. The distance she had to traverse was short, but it seemed long to her troubled mind. A block or two further on she paused before the door of a cellar coffee-room, one of the gathering places for the market people who came here in the early morning after bringing their wares from the country. At most other times of the day the dingy, unattractive little room was empty. When Mrs. Tunner descended the few steps and opened the door timidly, she found herself alone in the low-ceilinged, long, narrow space. A single gas flame threw a tiny radius of light beyond which was darkness. The room was empty, and Mrs. Tunner came in so quietly that the people she could hear and see moving about in the kitchen beyond did not notice her entrance. She took a seat in the darkest corner, a place from which she could watch the door. She sat there waiting in impatient anxiety, her eyes fastened, as if hypnotized, on the spot of brightness made by the metal doorknob. Finally, 15 or 20 minutes later, the shining knob turned, and the door flew open. A young man entered hastily, slamming the door roughly behind him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, although thin in figure, and his smooth-shaven face, even in the dim light, showed signs of dissipation. The furtive glance of his keen eyes was lacking in the candor and brightness which should belong to his years. "Carl!" The voice came out of the darkness, and he peered through the gloom until he caught sight of the woman sitting there. "Oh, you're there, are you?" he answered angrily. "Why didn't you creep into a rat-hole and be done with it?" "That is what I would like to do," said Mrs. Tunner bitterly. "Come over here to me." The young man laughed and replied in a lower tone, "Not much. I'm not over anxious to sit right under the gaslight either. And if we stay in that corner, they'll light the lamp right over your head. If we go nearer the other light, it will be still dark enough, and they're not likely to burn extra gas for us, too." He moved over to another place, and Mrs. Tunner followed him. She sat so that she had the light at her back and could see his face clearly. It was a face of good lines, which would have been noticeably attractive had it not showed all too plainly the marks of a life of dissipation. The woman's eyes seemed to drink in its every feature with a look of love that was like physical agony. In spite of the hollows drawn by years of sorrow and toil in her own face, there was enough resemblance between the two to mark them as mother and son. "Did you just come in too?" he asked. "No, I've been here some time." "And no one saw you yet?" he continued. When she shook her head in reply, he drummed on the table with a knife, and the door at the end of the room opened. "Why, there's someone here!" exclaimed an astonished voice as a young woman peered out from the kitchen. Carl Tunner ordered 2 coffees, and when the woman had returned to the kitchen, he addressed his mother again in a low but impatient tone. "Did you bring the money?" Mrs. Tunner straightened up suddenly, the sadness in her face giving away to a look of determination mingled with burning anxiety. Why are you going away now? Why do you have to go so suddenly? What is it that is driving you away? Just now. Now that—" She stopped and looked at him, her whole troubled soul in her eyes. Carl stared at her at first in astonishment, then his eyes dropped, and he moved his hand mechanically over the tablecloth. "Answer me," commanded Mrs. Tunner. The boy raised his head again with a look of defiance. "I'm going away because I happen to want to, because I can't find anything to do here, because I have to go away, if you must know. Any more you'd like to ask?" "Carl!" "Yes, that's my name." "Then you have sunk as low as that?" "Pretty low, and it's your fault." "Mine? My fault?" "Whose else? Who's going to help me if not my own mother?" "Haven't I helped you many times?" "But your affection seems to have a limit. You said just now—" Carl Tunner broke off his speech as the woman came out of the kitchen with the tray. After serving them, she started towards the next gaslight, but Carl motioned to her that it would not be necessary. The woman, who was quite pretty, smiled in answer to his impudent glance and left them alone again. Carl put his spoon in his cup and began to pick off the skin formed by the hot milk as carefully as if he hadn't another thought in the world. His mother clenched her fists and almost hissed through her closed teeth. "What's the matter?" said Carl lazily. "Everything," she began, in a tone that was low but piteously hard. "Yes, you are right. There is a limit to my affection. I seem now to be able to see clearer than a mother usually does. I have always been able to see your faults, and I see them all the more clearly now. Try as I may, I can find no excuse for them. You have not inherited them, and I have done all I could to bring you up properly, to make an honest man of you. You have never heard me utter an untruth. You have never seen me idle or exacting, and yet you are a liar. You are lazy, seeking only your own pleasure, no matter at what price. No, don't interrupt me. If you don't want to drive me to despair, let me talk now. I sit here like a beggar woman, with my son who is no better than a tramp and a vagabond." "Mother!" he hissed. "It is the truth, my son," she exclaimed bitterly. "You, the grandson of a general, the son of a noble father. You are nothing but a tramp today, perhaps even worse, much worse." "Mother, what do you mean?" "What is it that you think me capable of, then?" Carl's voice shook with anger, in which there was a note of fear. "I believe you, now, to be capable of anything." The word was like a knife thrust, and the young man shuddered as he sat there, his face drawn, his hands clenched. Suddenly the blood that had rushed up to the roots of his hair went back again, leaving his face white. He leaned back in his chair, his hands dropped helplessly in his lap. The terror in his face was reflected in that of his mother. "Capable of anything," she murmured, with pale lips. They sat for some few minutes in silence, a silence that was heavy with an unspoken horror. Finally, the woman regained control of herself. "I believe you capable of anything," she said again. "Of course you know why I am no longer in the greenhouse, why I am now living in my former cook." Again she paused. "Now you might speak, and yet you will not," she continued, her lips trembling. "I can imagine why you sent that suspicious-looking messenger to ask me to meet you here. You didn't dare to write me. You supposed that I would be under suspicion, that I would be watched, because I am your mother. Someone may have seen you the various times that you have visited me. It was 5 times in all, and the last time, in that dreadful night, you came without letting me know beforehand. You climbed over the wall, and you went out that way, too, because I could not get the key to the gate." Her voice dropped more and more towards the end of her sentence, and her strength would have failed her, but for the firmness of her will. Her son did not answer, did not attempt to defend himself. "It is only now that I am forced to believe you capable of anything," she began again, her voice growing harder. "Now that you tried to make me the instrument of your greed, of your criminal desires, now that you dared to demand of me that I should ask Erlach for money, and said that if he would not give it to me, you would get it from him. I do not know what it was you intended to do to obtain money from a miser like Erlach. I did not ask you. I turned you from the door. When you had left me, I fainted. I do not know how long I remained in that condition, and I do not know what happened during that time. I realize only now that you are the sort of man who would force his way into a strange house to get what he wanted." She stopped and sat still, scarcely breathing. Still there was no answer from her son. "I must get out into the air. I am ill," she murmured. She put her hand into the pocket of her dress and laid a purse on the table. "Here are 500 crowns. You can get away with this. I have no more. I have helped you too often. In the purse is a slip with the address of Katie's sister. Write to this address when you have found some place where you are safe. Carl, I am going now. Haven't you a word for me?" Carl Tunner did not raise his head. He had neither a look nor a word for the mother who had sacrificed everything for him, for the mother who, brought up in a home of luxury, had worked for years in menial positions to support him in idleness. She crept slowly to the door and turned back with a last look at her son, a look of unutterable love and unutterable sorrow. Then she went out into the wind and the rain, glad of the unfriendly elements that gave her strength again. Outside she lingered for a few moments, hoping Carl would follow her. When he did not come, she feared to attract attention by standing there, and walked on slowly until she came to the open door of a church. Here, in a dark corner, she sank to her knees and breathed out the anguish of her soul in a sobbing, passionate prayer. Carl Tunner sat for some time where she had left him, motionless. Finally he realized that he could not stay there forever. When he raised his head, his eyes looked dull and lifeless. He stretched out his hand to draw the purse to him, and saw through its red silk meshes that it contained a white slip of paper as well as the money. He opened the purse hastily and took out the paper with hands that trembled. He could not read the few words that were written there, for his eyes were dim with tears. Finally he managed to make out the writing. "My son, my love, my prayers, and my forgiveness will follow you wherever you may go. I am not strong enough to do what I should do, perhaps, and to accuse you openly. Save yourself and let me know when you are in security. But try to save your soul, too, that I may not repent of my great love for you, your mother." Carl Tunner sat looking down at the slip for some time. Finally he put it back in the purse, laid a piece of money on the table, and went out into the street. He wandered aimlessly about in the rain and the wind, heedless of the discomfort. His face was pale, and his eyes dimmed with sadness. Suddenly he realized what he was doing, and looking about, found himself outside of the city on the edge of an empty lot. "Ridiculous! How foolish of me!" he murmured and turned brusquely. But in spite of himself, his step dragged again, and the same sentence that circled through his brain and had driven him out into the night stood clear as if in letters of fire before his inward vision again. He dropped down on a stone by the wayside and buried his face in his hands, groaning aloud. "She believes me capable of anything, and oh God, it is true, it is true." End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Joseph Muller takes up the Erlach case. 10 days after Leopold Erlach's mysterious disappearance, Dr. Franz Lehr, commissioner of the criminal police in Vienna, sat in his office in earnest conversation with his good friend, Lieutenant Paul Erlach. The young lieutenant's attractive face looked worn and strained. After the usual first phrases, Dr. Lehr asked the question that had been on his mind since his friend entered the room. "You're not looking a bit well, Paul. Has your uncle's disappearance anything to do with it?" "I don't mind your asking that," replied Lieutenant Erlach with a bitter smile, "but I'm afraid there are a number of people thinking that same question without asking it. Here, read this letter, the second of the kind that I have received. This is what brings me to see you this morning, not only a desire to chat with you." "Well, I wondered," laughed Lehr, "but you really look as if this affair meant a lot to you. Now don't get angry. I mean, it looks as if you were really greatly interested. And yet I understood that there was no particular love lost between yourself and your uncle." "Quite right." "Then what's the matter now? These letters? Anonymous letters?" "Naturally. Letters like this are not usually signed." Lehr opened the envelope that was handed him. A man's hand disguised. "What is it he has to say?" "Debts, card. Debts, other. Debts, difficult father-in-law. And a missing uncle. That's a rather good combination. The uncle will be found sooner or later. Dead, of course. And no traces left by which anything could be discovered. Then the heir can come into possession of his fortune. Prost Malzeit, one who knows." "A rascal, and a cowardly one at that," said Lehr when he had read the letter. "When did you get this?" "This morning." "Will you leave it here with me?" the commissioner asked. "And you haven't an idea who wrote it?" "Not an idea, not the faintest suspicion. But the clause about the father-in-law is news to me. I didn't know you were engaged. My heartiest congratulations." Can't accept them, I'm sorry to say. I am not engaged yet. I haven't even spoken to her. Why should I? I don't want to bind her when I can't marry her. She shall be free. But you love each other, and there's someone who knows it, and who isn't pleased at the fact. Yes, I have thought of that already, said Paul. It was a natural conclusion. It will be more difficult, but not too much so, possibly, to find out just who he is. How am I going to do that? With the help of the lady you wish to marry. Nellie? Nellie's her name, is it? It's a pretty name. I suppose the lady herself is equally attractive. Paul Erlach smiled up at his friend, a smile of happiness that was tinged with melancholy. I shan't try to describe her. What's the good? What's the good of even thinking of her? It only saddens me. What's the trouble? We can't either of us raise the money demanded by the law. Her father, he's retired now, was my superior officer, went bond for a friend and got caught. What's the use of talking about it? But to this matter, how can I drag Nellie into this? How can she help us? She can help us very much. I am taking for granted that this letter was written by a rival in love. What were the contents of the other letter you speak of? Just about the same as this. Umph. The writer has very little imagination and few ideas. It's postmarked Linz, said Erlach. The commissioner laughed. That shows how little you know about those things. A letter can be sent from anywhere through a third party. Under the circumstances, the fact that you are not yet engaged, I mean, the writer's knowledge of your interest in Miss Nellie, and hers in you, shows that he must be someone who is also interested in the young lady. She must know who her various admirers are. A woman always does. You ask her about it. It is the only way. Mercy, what's the matter? Why that deep sigh? Are you really so badly in debt? The commissioner bent over to look his friend in the eyes, a sincere sympathy in his own glance. The lieutenant shook his head. That's a lie about the card debts, he said sadly. I got out of that by going more deeply in debt to a moneylender. It's a burden, of course, but at least it's not a debt of honor. But how am I going to face Nellie and her father with a letter like this, casting doubt on my honor? Now that's ridiculous, said Lear calmly. An anonymous letter hurts nobody, throws no slur on anybody but the writer. Your prospective father-in-law, if he's a man of sense, will tell you that also. But there's another thing, said Paul. How do I know that the suggestions in this letter are not being circulated as gossip among my acquaintances? How do I know that malicious hints are not being thrown out, even going so far as to accuse me of having a hand in the disappearance of my uncle? Yes, that's a more important side of it, said the commissioner, holding out his hand to his friend. Call on me if there is anything I can do for you in the matter. In fact, I was about to ask you to put the case into our hands, although from another reason. What other reason? This anonymous writer appears to know so much about your uncle's disappearance that it might be he had a hand in it himself. Oh, it is possible, I say. I'm not yet ready to assert that it is probable. Then you think we had better not ignore these letters? We must not ignore anything that might in any way have to do with your uncle. That's true. I'll be very glad if you will give me your advice in this matter. You see here what the man says. The uncle will be found sooner or later, dead, of course, and no trace is left by which anything could be discovered. Then the heir can come into possession of his fortune. Lear interrupted hastily. That is very important. Don't you see that this man is in possession of the fact that you are your uncle's only heir, a knowledge which lessens still more the number of those upon whom suspicion could fall? And here's another thing. You see this, Prost Mahlzeit? We use that expression little in Austria. It's a North German expression altogether. Do you remember any of your friends in the habit of using it? Paul Erlach pondered a moment. No, he said then. I don't know of anyone. But there was something else I wanted to say to you. It concerns my uncle's disappearance. About which you probably know less than we do here. The local authorities haven't asked for any assistance in the matter as yet, but the case interests me and I have been following the developments closely. But I don't see just how I am going to help you there. You can help me by recommending a capable detective. I want a man, if there are such, who would take up the case not merely as a matter of professional duty, but because it interests him. I've heard there are such people. Yes, there are, said the commissioner. But I suppose their services are very expensive? Everything that's really good costs money. The men such as you describe are the rare talents that are sought for everywhere. Hold on, I know the man you want. A capable man? Capable. He's the best detective I ever knew or heard of. What's his name? His name is very unimportant. He has 100 names and 100 different disguises, and in every one of them he has done marvelous things. But the name he was born to is Joseph Muller. A very ordinary-sounding name. It suits the man's ordinarily quiet appearance. He left the force some time ago, but he is still busy as a private detective." "I don't suppose I could afford it," said Erlach sadly. "Anyway, I should have to suggest to him a rather peculiar method of payment." "What do you mean?" asked Lear. Erlach flushed hotly and looked embarrassed. You never thought of me as avaricious, did you?" Lear laughed. "The last person in the world. What's the trouble?" "And yet I can't seem to think of anything else these days except Uncle's money, and the fact that I am his heir, and that he has never had any reason to disinherit me, and that he has never hinted at any other disposal of his fortune. Now, if he were dead, if we knew he were dead, but you see we don't know, we only know that he's disappeared, and that we haven't found him, and we may never find him, and if we don't, then 30 years have to pass before the state will hand the money out to me. 30 years! I'll be 64 then, if I'm alive at all. I keep thinking of this all the time, and I despise myself for doing so." "There's no reason why you should," said the Commissioner. "It's perfectly natural of you to feel that way. Anyone would in your position. I quite understand that it is a matter of the greatest importance for you to discover proofs of your uncle's death, if he is dead. And I think I know what you mean by the peculiar method of payment. You mean you want a detective who will undertake the case on his own risk, because if he discovers proofs of Leopold Erlach's death, you will then be in a position to pay him well. Am I not right?" "Perfectly," said the lieutenant with a faint smile. "And I'd much rather you'd say it than I." "You're ridiculously sensitive," continued the Commissioner, pressing a button on his desk. When the attendant entered, Lear said, "Call up number 1234 and ask the gentleman if he can come here to my office." "You must telephone Muller pretty often if you know his number so well," said Paul Erlach. The Commissioner laughed and wrote out the numbers 1234 on a slip of paper. "It's easy, you see," he said, then turned to the attendant who re-entered. "Mr. Muller will be here in 20 minutes," said the man. Lear nodded and turned to Erlach. "Can you wait?" "I'll run across to the cafe to say a word to a friend who is waiting for me there, and I'll come right back." "You'll find Muller a most original person, but you mustn't judge of other detectives from him. He's what you might call a white crow, a very remarkable man in every way. He is one of the really wise people in this world, those who understand everything and can forgive everything. He is almost a rich man now and has a very comfortable little home. I visit him occasionally, and it is always a most enjoyable evening. The woman who has kept house for him for many years is a former thief who has served a term in prison. His coachman and his gardener are also released convicts. They'd go through fire for him." "He certainly must be an unusual man." "He is indeed, a man of remarkable capability. We'll not find another like him on the official force. We hated to have him go, but he has one serious fault." "That's interesting. What is it?" "His heart runs away with him." "Why, what do you mean?" "I mean that when he has discovered the criminal, solved the problem that no one else could solve, then he's so sorry for this criminal that he helps him to escape." "Why, that's delicious. Really, it's great." "It does sound attractive. And after all, it's practical, too, for there are several times when he has saved the innocent family of a criminal from shame and disgrace, because some of those he warned have taken the matter into their own hands and played the executioner themselves, thereby saving time and money for the state as well." "I certainly am curious to meet such a man," said Erlach. "I'll run down now and be right back." As he stormed up the stairs on his return, Lieutenant Erlach almost ran down a man slowly and quietly going the same way. "I beg your pardon," he exclaimed hastily, without turning, and disappeared into the Commissioner's room. "Isn't he here yet?" he asked. "He's too punctual to be here yet. There's still 15 seconds' time. There he is at the door. As I told you, he is very punctual." The door opened, and on the threshold stood the middle-aged gentleman whom the lieutenant had collided with on the stairs. "Good morning, Commissioner," he said in a gentle, pleasant voice. Dr. Lear greeted Muller cordially and introduced the two men. The detective placed his hat carefully on the table and settled himself comfortably in the chair which Lear had placed for him. Then he said, "Well, gentlemen, I am ready. What can I do for you?" The impressionable lieutenant felt a wave of sympathy and confidence fill his heart at the calm, steady glance of the older man's quiet gray eyes. In spite of the simplicity of Muller's bearing, there was an authority about it that seemed to invite reliance on his capabilities. The young officer began at once. "First of all, Mr. Muller, I must explain to you that I am a poor man and not in a position—" "To pay for detective work?" Muller finished the sentence calmly. Suppose we talk about the case, sir, and leave the unimportant details until later. But it isn't unimportant for me, this matter of putting myself under obligation to anyone, continued the young officer gravely. Before I dare take advantage of your valuable services, I wish to have it clearly stated that it is only possible for me to pay for them when, and if, my uncle's death is proven. If he is not dead, it will only be possible for me to pay you slowly in installments after I have worked off other debts previously contracted. I feel that I must explain this first before taking up any more of your time. Erlach leaned back in his chair with a deep breath. Muller smiled pleasantly. Well, now you have explained it, Lieutenant, and I understand perfectly. Now let's talk about the important matters. What opinion have you formed about your uncle's disappearance? Then you've been following the case in the papers, and haven't come to any conclusion yourself yet? The detective shrugged his shoulders. Neither have I, continued Erlach eagerly. Although of course it is easier for me to overlook this case than it would be for you, as you know neither the person nor the neighborhood in question. A scarcely perceptible smile hovered on Muller's lips, a smile noticed only by the police commissioner, whose eyes gleamed in response. Dr. Lair took out his cigar case. This looks to me as if it were going to be a lengthy conference, he said. Suppose we have a cigar. My uncle was a bachelor, continued Erlach. The newspapers mentioned this point also, but what they did not mention was the fact that no woman has ever been concerned in his life at all. I am telling you this now, that you may not waste time in the usual search for the woman in the case. Muller bowed lightly, and the young officer kept on with his report. My uncle had no vices and very few secrets in his life. He was 65 years old when his mysterious disappearance occurred, and his life had been so absolutely commonplace that this happening is quite incomprehensible. As to his servants, the gardener Till and his wife, and his housekeeper Mrs. Tunner, were the only ones there at the moment. The Tills had been with him for 14 years, Mrs. Tunner had been in Uncle's service only 2 years, but she had proved herself faithful and willing, and had given many evidences of the fact that she was not in the least greedy for money. May I ask how you know all this about the servants? Put in Muller. I understand that you were not on any terms of intimacy with your uncle. Erlach sighed deeply. It wasn't easy to get on with him, he answered. He was distrustful and believed no good of anybody. If I showed friendliness or affection for him, he would have taken it for toadyism, and yet he was continually accusing me of ingratitude and coldness of heart because I did not bother myself more about him. I don't see exactly how I could have done it. I've had very little time to myself since I have been here in Vienna, and I was stationed in Linz before that. My visits to Inzersdorf were necessarily few and far between. I can't say that I was anxious to make them any more frequent, for they gave me no particular pleasure. But when I did go there, Uncle's servants were his main topic of conversation. He was no great reader, cared little for art in any form, and knew nothing of politics. All that occupied his mind were the petty affairs of his garden and his household. There was very little he could talk about, but he could talk about his servants rather interestingly. His mental horizon was narrow, but within these limits he was a keen observer. He could talk well about his garden and his experiments with his flowers, and he knew the composition and the quality of almost any dish he had eaten which had particularly pleased him. As these things were about all he talked about when I did visit him, I couldn't help remembering some one or other of his remarks. This is how I came to know that my uncle was perfectly satisfied with the Tills and with his housekeeper. With his housekeeper, too? Inquired Muller. Erlach was surprised at what occurred to be a particular interest on Muller's part in this woman. Like the gardener Till, the young officer had noticed Mrs. Tunner's look of anxiety and trouble. He had always respected her quiet reserve and faithfulness to duty, and like Till also, he did not wish through anything he might say to bring more worry and trouble to this woman. He cut in hastily now. Yes, my uncle was particularly pleased with Mrs. Tunner. She was quite alone in the world, which was a quality that uncle liked in a servant, and she was an excellent worker, although she was very evidently a woman of refinement and intelligence above her station. She was the most economical housekeeper uncle had ever had, and when he was sick she took the best care of him. He told me several times that he had never been so comfortable. It does not seem to me in the least possible or necessary to connect this woman in any way with my uncle's disappearance, although I know that the local authorities have considered it a possibility. One must not neglect any possibility in a case like this. Perhaps even the possibility that I might have something to do with it? Exclaimed the lieutenant in a tone of irritation. Even that possibility must be taken into consideration. Sir, we are merely talking of all the possibilities which might be concerned in this still unexplained case, replied Muller quietly. You have told me much of importance, Lieutenant, but even you have not been able to shed any light upon the most incomprehensible part of this mystery. You mean the locking of the doors on the inside? Yes, and then when one considers the way the house is built— What do you know about the way the house is built? Interrupted Erlach, in surprise which was increased by the detective's answer. I obtained a plan of the house a few days ago, for when 4 or 5 days had passed and nothing had been discovered in this case, the matter began to interest me. The lieutenant gave an exclamation of astonishment, and the police commissioner smiled as he said to himself, that was a real Muller trick. The detective turned to him now. You'll be interested to see the scene of the mystery, Dr. Lair, he said. I have the plan in my pocket here. Let's have a look at it. The commissioner laid down his cigar and bent over the paper. The young officer sat still in surprise at this man who had already taken up an investigation of the case, even before he was engaged for it. It's extremely interesting, said the commissioner. The walls are 9 or 10 feet high, both garden gates bolted on the inside, both the old gentleman's rooms locked on the inside, and yet he has disappeared. Really, it is quite incomprehensible. Muller pointed to a particular spot on the plan. Right here, at that spot of the brick wall which lies opposite the gardener's house and the stable, somebody has climbed either in or out recently. How do you know that? Exclaimed Erlach. I have been examining that spot. You were there? The detective smiled at this unnecessary question. It must have been a young man, or if not young, still very active. Who told you that? Muller smiled again, this time quite broadly. I told it to myself, he said calmly. I'm no longer young, but I'm still quite active, and I climbed over the same place myself. You were in the garden, too? Yes, I was there for 4 hours. Quite time enough to get wet to my skin, for it was raining hard. But I was rather glad of the rain, because it gave me the assurance that there would be nobody else prowling around in the deserted estate. No one saw me go out, either, for I did not leave until it was quite dark. Did you go into the house, too? Muller shook his head. No, I couldn't get into the house. The keys were at the county station, and the locks were complicated ones. The detective halted with a laugh, and the commissioner, laughing also, completed the sentence. So you couldn't open the doors with your own instruments? Exactly. But I didn't even try to get into the house nor into any of the other buildings, which would have been easier, for it was really no affair of mine. But you did climb over the wall, said Erlach. Exactly. I thought I might take that much interest in the matter. And I didn't even do that until I was quite convinced that someone else had done the same thing a short time before. You're quite sure of that? And did you discover anything more? No, nothing more. There was no one anywhere about the place. A clock in the next room struck 11. Muller rose. Have you anything else to say to me, sir? I must be in my own home again by 5 o'clock. No, said Erlach. Only please leave me your address. I am supposing that you have already undertaken the case, and we really must talk about the payment. Some other time, interrupted Muller. Really and truly, that is only a side issue. Or, if you insist, it is easily enough settled. If it's not possible to discover your uncle's whereabouts or the fact of his death, then I'll look upon the whole thing as simply an interesting experiment. If you do come in possession of his fortune, you can pay me whatever you like. The commissioner is witness to this agreement. But I can't accept any such arrangement, persisted Erlach. Oh, yes, you can, said Dr. Lair. You see, you don't happen to know that our friend Muller has a perfect passion for interesting cases, also that he is very well off. And also that I do not accept this interesting case under any other conditions, said Muller firmly. Erlach struggled with himself for a moment, then took Muller's outstretched hand. Very well, then, but you must give me your address. The detective shook his head. No, you shan't have it. Why not? Because you must not come to see me, nor must you write me. No, I cannot explain it now. But I have your telephone number. Muller gave a start. Please do not make use of it. This is a very important matter, Lieutenant. Please do as I ask. You may spoil an important line of investigation if you will not. You can send me news through the commissioner, or meet me here or at any other place except my house, at any time you wish. Also, you can leave your address with me. When he had taken the officer's card, Muller turned to Dr. Lair. And now I have to thank you, sir, for helping me to get the official charge of this most interesting case. The commissioner smiled. I suppose you'll never lose passion for your work, will you? He said. When will you begin your investigations? Asked Erlach. At once. I must make an examination of the greenhouse between now and 4 o'clock, for I have an important appointment in my own house at 5, and the journey will take about an hour." Muller's eyes shone, and his cheeks were flushed. His whole frame seemed more tense in the excitement of his task. His enthusiasm was contagious. "Then I must get you the keys at once," exclaimed Erlach. "Yes, please. My carriage is waiting." As the little brougham drove rapidly through the streets, the two men inside sat in silence. Muller was no great talker, particularly not in the beginning of a case, and the young officer had not yet recovered from his bewilderment at finding the investigations, which he had thought to start, already in full swing. It lacked still some minutes of 1 o'clock when the carriage stopped at the courthouse in Leasing, but it was nearly half an hour before Muller could come into possession of the keys. Then he drove the lieutenant to the railway station and returned to his carriage. "Now, Heberlein," he said to his coachman, "drive me to the place where you waited for me 3 days ago." Again the carriage rolled along the high roads to Inzersdorf, past meadowland and ploughed fields, then again along a stretch of dreary wasteland which was known as the Black Moor. They turned off at a little dip in the road, down a grass-grown lane to a spot that was hidden from the main street by a heavy high willow thicket. Muller dismounted here and set out across the open land, above which floated a heavy mist. Several paths, some of them almost roads, led across this dreary stretch of country. Muller already knew the various directions of these roads. He knew also that 2 stately gardens, protected by their high walls, broke the monotony of this damp expanse of moorland. There were a few little streamlets flowing across it, hardly worthy the name, and yet wide enough to need a bridge. Muller crossed one of these bridges now, it was scarcely more than a plank, and took the path to the left. About 100 paces further he found himself in an avenue framed on either side by tall old beech trees. The avenue was not long and ended at a high green-painted iron gate in a brick wall. This was one of the entrances to the Erlach property. During his walk over the moor, Muller had been looking around him cautiously, and was satisfied that there was no one within sight. Nothing broke the silence of the dreary spot as he stood listening at the gate. He opened it and went in, remaining inside for 2 hours. When he came out he knew little more than he did before, but he had made one discovery. In the drawer of a cupboard in Mrs. Tunner's room, a drawer which was filled with old newspapers, he had found a man's silk muffler. It was a piece of cheap, brightly colored silk, of the sort affected by young dandies of the lower class. He had found it thrust in hastily under the papers. This attracted his attention, for everything else in the room showed him that Mrs. Tunner was an extremely neat and tidy person. She must have put the muffler in its place at a moment when she was in haste or greatly flustered about something, for otherwise she would not have been likely to keep the piece of silk in a drawer with newspapers. The last paper which had been put in the drawer bore the date of the 8th of September. The issue of September 9th lay in Erlach's room, and Erlach had disappeared on the night of September 9th. If nothing had happened in the house, Mrs. Tunner would probably have read the issue of the 9th on the 10th of September and would have placed it in the drawer. But on the morning of September 10th all was in confusion in the greenhouse. Mrs. Tunner's own room was in order, but the dining room and Erlach's apartments were in the same condition that they had been from the moment of the discovery. Muller knew that Mrs. Tunner had not been alone in the house after the discovery until the time when she had left it in the afternoon. He knew also that she had returned to her own room only to pack her trunk, and that this had been done in the presence of a constable. She had therefore not had time to take the muffler from the drawer in which she had thrust it, nor had she had time to put the muffler in the drawer, for she had taken only a few most necessary things with her. Now this muffler must have been put into the drawer on the morning of the 10th of September before the arrival of the police commissioner, and there must have been some reason for the woman's desire to hide it. It had very likely been left in her room during the night of the 9th to the 10th of September, for Muller had discovered another proof that at some time during that night Mrs. Tunner had had a visitor in the kitchen. A tea service for 2 people, with remains of a light repast, was thrust in a heap on a corner of the kitchen table. The dishes used were the heavier kitchenware, quite different from the fine porcelain kept for Mr. Erlach. It was clear that Mrs. Tunner had had a visitor at some time in the evening after the hour when she had served her master's supper, for all the dishes used for this meal were clean and in their accustomed places. Muller was almost certain that he knew who it was that had visited Mrs. Tunner on that critical evening, and yet as he walked back over the black moor, he felt that he knew little more about the mystery than he did before. But Muller had learned to be patient. He reached his own home a few minutes before 5 o'clock. It was a comfortable little old-fashioned house set in a garden, with hedge and wall protecting it from passers on the main street of the suburb. "Has the new cook arrived?" asked Muller of the young man who opened the door for him. "And has Mrs. Groner left?" "Yes, sir," said the young man, taking Muller's hat. "Send the woman up to me at once," said the detective, mounting the half-flight to his sitting-room. He stood at the window, looking aimlessly out into the garden. The gleam in his eyes showed satisfaction, with just a hint of curiosity. There was a knock on the door, and as he answered it, the old detective turned slowly round. A tall, gaunt woman stood on the threshold, a woman whose face might at one time have been beautiful, but the lines of it were faded and worn now, and the great dark eyes were full of sorrow. Muller came a few steps to meet her. "Welcome to my house, Mrs. Tunner," he said cordially. "I hope that we will get along well together. Two such quiet, elderly people as we are certainly ought to be able to make life easier for each other." He held out his hand to her, and as she took it, 2 great tears rolled down her cheeks. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Muller's new housekeeper. It was on September 20th that Mrs. Tunner entered Joseph Muller's service, 10 days after the disappearance of Leopold Erlach, and the 3rd day after her painful meeting with her son. No mere chance, but Muller's own determination, had brought the woman to his house. From the moment that the Erlach case began to interest him, he had been making inquiries about the servants in the establishment. There was nothing whatever to be found out about the Tills. They were ordinary, commonplace, faithful people. But Mrs. Tunner proved more interesting. Muller's experience had taught him that widows who are serving in a menial position, although noticeably above their station, were apt to have a past that might prove worth investigating. He looked up Mrs. Tunner's record in the Inzersdorf police station, found the date of her arrival there, and also the statement that she had been born in Innsbruck in the Tyrol and was now 48 years old. He traced up her former terms of service without difficulty until about 15 or 16 years back. In his search, Muller found that there were several other people in Vienna who bore the name of Tunner. Only one of these people interested him. This was a man by the name of Karl Tunner, who was 27 years old and who was also recorded as having been born in Innsbruck. This young man had wandered about the country a good deal, according to the record, and had had various professions. He had been assistant to a photographer, he had been a chorus singer in one of the smaller theaters, and he had also been in vaudeville. As he followed up the official records of the life of this versatile youth, Muller became more and more convinced that Karl Tunner was Teresa Tunner's son. Muller also knew the address to which Mrs. Tunner had gone when she left the greenhouse. Furthermore, he knew that she had advertised for a position. He let his own faithful housekeeper answer the advertisement and engage Mrs. Tunner for her master. Mrs. Tunner saw no reason to doubt the other woman's story that she was obliged to leave her position, possibly for several months, to take care of an invalid sister. All this Muller had done on his own responsibility. Therefore, he was greatly pleased when he was officially engaged for the Erlach case. He had also learned several things of importance from the young lieutenant. When the latter asserted what his uncle must have told him, that Mrs. Tunner was quite alone in the world, Muller, who knew better, wondered why the woman had lied. When she entered his household, he apparently troubled himself very little about her after the first greeting. But in reality, he himself, as well as his servant Conrad and his coachman, both of whom were in his confidence, were watching the woman's every movement. Everything that was needed for the household had been bought for the next 2 or 3 days, and it was Conrad's duty to post all letters and to receive those left at the door. Therefore, there was no way in which Mrs. Tunner could communicate with the outside world unnoticed. But the woman herself was quite satisfied with this arrangement. The less she had to go out, the better she liked it, and she knew her son to be in safety. For before she had left Mrs. Menger, the woman in whose home she had been living, The latter's sister had already received a letter from Karl to be forwarded to his mother. Mrs. Tunner could not bear to destroy the few lines written by her only child. She put them in her trunk. She thought that now, in the house of this pleasant old man, about whom she knew nothing further than that he was living quietly on his income, she would be safe from all intrusion. On her first entrance into the house, some of the strain of her nerves seemed to relax, and she felt that if it were possible for her ever to be happy again, she might be happy here. The day following her arrival, Muller sent for Mrs. Tunner and asked her if she would mind going out. He had to send Conrad on an errand, and he discovered that Mrs. Groner had forgotten to order some articles from the delicatessen store, of which he was particularly fond. He would give her a list, and Conrad would drive her in Muller's own carriage. As he handed her the list and the money, he looked at her sharply and asked, "Are you ill, Mrs. Tunner? You don't look a bit well today. Perhaps I had better not send you out. It's so raw and cold. If you don't want to go, don't be afraid to say so." "Oh, no, sir, indeed I am not ill, and I'm not afraid of the weather, but it's no wonder I look sick, after what I've been through with." "Indeed, what was it?" "Haven't you heard of the occurrence in Inzersdorf, sir?" "No, I don't seem to remember. What was it?" "A rich old man disappeared mysteriously." "Oh, yes, I remember now. It was in the papers. But how does that concern you?" "Concern me? Why, I was his housekeeper, and I was alone with him in the house at the time of his disappearance." "Indeed, that is most interesting. You must tell me all about it. You will probably be able to give many more details than the newspapers did." "Oh, no, sir. I know nothing whatever about it. Nothing more than anyone else. Nothing more than what was in the papers." These last words were spoken in a quiet, monotonous tone. Muller wondered whether the woman had uttered them so often that they became like a speech she had learned. He also wondered at her deliberately calling up the subject herself. Was it intentional? Was it from a desire on her part to avoid an unexpected mention of it? These questions filled Muller's brain as he pushed a chair forward for her and said, in the tone of a child pleased at the thought of hearing a gruesome story, "Oh, do sit down here and tell me all about it. I read only a short notice, just mentioning the occurrence, and it's so much more interesting to hear about it from someone who was there. You must tell me all about it." Mrs. Tunner smiled slightly at his childlike eagerness. She told her story with the same bare fidelity to facts that she had shown all along. She did not mention her son, nor did she say anything about the specter of horrible doubt that had clouded her mind since the morning of the 10th of September. Muller threw in a question now and then, a question cleverly devised to lead her on to say more. He knew enough of the case to see that the woman, in what she did say, was telling him absolutely the truth. But with the keen, inexplainable other sense that made him the man he was, he felt that Mrs. Tunner was hiding something from him, something that might not have been actual knowledge, but was at least a supposition. When she had finished her story, she rose from her chair with the words, "So you can imagine, sir, that I did not want to stay in that house another night." "I can indeed. It was quite natural that you should have preferred to go back to your own family." "Mrs. Menger is no relation of mine." "Are you alone in the world, then?" The question came quite naturally from Muller's lips. The woman hesitated a second or two too long. Then she said, "I have a son." "Indeed, and he is not with you here?" "No, I do not know where he is. I have had no news from him for some time. He is at sea. He is a sailor." The words came very slowly, heavily. Muller could see how hard it was for this woman to lie. He felt sorry for her. "That was very interesting. The carriage will be ready at 3 o'clock." Mrs. Tunner bowed, took up the coffee cups, and left the room. The detective looked after her, his face very grave. Why did she lie to me? Anybody could see she was lying. Muller's face was very sad, for the woman had already aroused his full sympathy. Conrad and the new housekeeper drove off at 3 o'clock, and Muller went downstairs into Mrs. Tunner's room. He was now entirely alone in the house, and the little room looked out only on the garden. He drew the curtains and lit his tiny lantern, for it was a gloomy day and already almost dark. Then the detective started in on the examination of the belongings of his new housekeeper. There was little to be found in the cupboard and closet of the room. A few pieces of clothing only, neat and clean, but much mended, lay packed away in the drawers. Muller wondered why this woman, who had been through many years of service in well-paid positions, should be so poor, should have so little money to spend on herself. She must have had some use for her salary which deprived her of any advantage from it. Then Muller turned to the trunk. The lock was simple, and he could open it easily. It was only half full. A large package done up in white paper lay on top. Muller opened the package and found himself looking down at a handsome white satin gown cut in a style of several decades back, the costly stuff already yellowing from disuse. A white veil lay with the gown in the package, and a faded myrtle wreath. Muller's eyes grew dim with sympathy as he carefully rewrapped the package. Below it in the trunk were 3 smaller boxes. In the first he found a pair of baby shoes, worn and faded. Also a folded school composition book of the primary grade, on which stood in a stiff, childish hand the name Carl Tunner. In the second box was the uniform cap of a general of infantry and a death certificate written by an Innsbruck priest to the effect that General Anton Maltner, Chevalier von Roch, had died on the 26th of July, 1879. In the third box, which Muller opened after carefully closing the other 2, were photographs, bundles of letters, and family papers. He sat down to the examination of this box, and it took him more than an hour. When he had got through, he knew the history of Mrs. Tunner's life. He knew that she had been brought up in luxury, in a high social position, that she was the daughter of a general and wife of a man of means, but that death and reverses had left her alone in the world to bring up her son by her own efforts. There were several photographs of this boy at various stages of his childhood and youth. The latest one, taken possibly a year or 2 ago, interested Muller most. It was a costume portrait of a very good-looking young man in Greek dress, with the exaggerated hair and jewelry of a comic opera part. Written on the back of this picture were Carl Tunner's own remarks as to his success in the part. Also, there was a letter, written somewhat later, in which he said that he was tired of the photographic business and wanted to return to the stage, for which he felt he was well fitted. In the few letters that were there, Muller could see what Mrs. Tunner must have suffered from the vagaries of her son, whose idle, pleasure-loving, and unscrupulous character lay clear before the reader. The last letter that the detective found was hastily written in pencil on a torn slip and thrust into an envelope which was not addressed. The word Tunner was written on it in pencil. The letter read as follows: "I was a fool to suggest what I did to you on that dreadful night. If you could only have helped me in time, I would not now be in hiding. I thank you from my heart for what you have now done for me. The money will help me to get away. I thank you deeply for your letter. You can be easy about me. I will tell you more when I feel that it will be safe for me to see you again. K." Muller read these lines carefully several times, his face very grave. Then he copied them in his notebook, murmuring half aloud, "Oh, that dreadful night." He closed the trunk and left the room. His heart was full of pity at the thought of what this woman must have suffered in the varied experiences of her life. Then his mind came back to the business of the moment, to this woman's possible connection with the mysterious occurrence in Inzersdorf. Was the dreadful night of which Carl Tunner wrote the night of the 9th of September? This much stood clear. Carl Tunner was in hiding, had fled from the city. His mother had not been able to help him in time, but later she had given him considerable money. And mixed up in this somehow was what the careless lad himself spoke of as the dreadful night. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5, Part 1 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Return of the Prodigal. Conrad and Mrs. Tunner returned to the house about 5 o'clock. The housekeeper set about preparing the afternoon coffee, and as she did so her thoughts went back to her son's last letter. "You can be easy about me," she repeated half aloud, while a sad smile flitted across her pale face. These words gave her renewed hope and comfort, although there was nothing to tell her whether they indicated his innocence in regard to the occurrences in the greenhouse, or had reference merely to his present safety. She did not know where he had posted the letter to Katie's sister, for she had not seen the envelope. Carl had not told her where he was, so she could not write to him. But she was not anxious to do so. She realized that she was probably being watched by the police, and any move on her part to communicate with Karl might be dangerous to the latter, for even if her worst suspicions were not justified, he must have done something wrong, that was certain. And this wrong thing, whatever it was, had been done on the night of the 9th of September, or shortly afterwards, for it was several days after that he had sent a messenger to her asking her to meet him in the coffee cellar and to bring money for him, as he was obliged to leave Vienna at once. She could only hope and pray that whatever might be the reason for his flight, it would not be the one terrible thing she feared. Shortly after she had carried up the coffee tray to Muller's sitting room, he sent down word for her to come up again, as he had something to say to her. She ascended the stairs mechanically and found Muller seated at his desk in the cozy room. He held a newspaper in his hand, and there were several more heaped up on the side of the desk. The lamp was already lit, although there was still some daylight outside. "You sent for me, sir?" said Mrs. Tunner, walking slowly over to the desk. Muller raised his head to greet her, and his left hand fell carelessly on an open newspaper that lay near the edge of the desk. The paper fell to the ground. Mrs. Tunner moved to bend down for it, her hand outstretched. Then she stopped as if suddenly turned to stone, and her left hand slowly extended itself with a gesture of hiding something from her own gaze. Her eyes widened as they rested on the top of the desk, and her face was ghastly pale. She gave one deep, gasping breath, then fell forward unconscious in the arms of the man who sprang up to catch her. "I didn't expect it would have that effect," murmured Muller as he rubbed her temples with water and then started for the next room in search of something stronger. But before he reached the threshold, he heard a deep sigh behind him. He turned back to the sofa. Mrs. Tunner was conscious again, but she lay there motionless, her wide-open eyes full of the same horror as before. "Where am I? Who are you? Who are you?" The words came low from between her trembling lips. Her eyes never left the edge of the desk, on which lay a bright-colored silk muffler. The master of the house drew up a chair to the sofa and sat down upon it. "My name is Joseph Muller, as you know," he said, "and it's also the truth that I am living retired on my income. We did not lie to you in that respect. But if we had told you that I am a detective, you probably would not have entered my service. Is this not so, Mrs. Tunner? No, don't move. And now, drink this water," Muller continued in a more friendly tone as he laid his hand gently on hers. "Don't try to hold back your tears. They may relieve you. Then we can talk about your son, Karl." He rose from his chair and went to the desk to lock the muffler in one of its drawers. Mrs. Tunner leaned her head on the arm of the sofa and wept bitterly. Muller's soft heart was torn with pity for the unhappy woman. He retreated to the depths of the window niche and waited there until the first spasm of her sorrow and fright had passed. A sudden noise behind him made him turn. Mrs. Tunner had risen from the sofa so hastily that the glass on the silver tray on the little table in front of her jarred loudly. "Well?" said Muller, turning his serious eyes full on the excited woman. She stood erect, her hands clenched, her eyes flaming, and hissed between her gasping sobs, "Oh, it's cruel! It's horribly cruel to force a mother to betray her own child in this way." "Then you have something to betray?" The words came quietly and slowly. The woman staggered and grew even more pale. Her mind seemed frozen. She could not master her thoughts. She grew dizzy and caught at the arm of the sofa to support herself. In the haze in her brain, she felt Muller's hand on her arm and heard his calm and gentle voice saying, "I am not your enemy, Mrs. Tunner. I am nobody's enemy, and if I ever can help anyone who is in trouble, I always do it. I have such deep sympathy for the fear, the shame, the despair of the captured criminal, that I am often obliged to help him to relieve the pressure of my own feelings. Therefore, you need not be afraid of me, and it will be better for yourself as well as for your son if you tell me the truth." While speaking, he had pressed Mrs. Tunner gently down onto the sofa again. She looked at him, still with the hanging horror in her eyes, and breathed low, I don't know the truth." "You do not?" "I do not know what happened in that dreadful night. I know nothing about it." Muller's voice was cooler as he asked quickly, at a random shot, "You do not even know that your son climbed the wall to come to you that evening?" Mrs. Tunner pressed her lips tight together, and her eyes dropped. Finally, she said, "Yes, I know that one thing, but that does not prove anything." She spoke with a pause between each word, as if fighting for strength. "One thing it proves," replied Muller, "and that is that your Karl came to you secretly on the very night of the mysterious occurrence in the greenhouse." "Why shouldn't a son visit his mother?" stammered the terrified woman. "A son does not usually climb walls to get to his mother," replied the detective, "although this is an unusual case, and therefore—" "Oh, my God! If only I could do something to explain it," cut in Mrs. Tunner. "You fixed some supper for your son," continued Muller. "Yes, I did. He was cold and hungry. I gave him an old woolen vest that Mr. Erlach had done with. That was why he forgot his muffler." Mrs. Tunner's voice was firmer now and just a little defiant. "Those are unimportant details," said Muller with a smile. "The main point is, why did he come to you in such secrecy that night? The cold supper and the old vest you gave him would hardly be the reason for his climbing the wall. He wanted something more, Mrs. Tunner. You surely must know that sooner or later we will find out why your son came to you that evening. It will be much better for you to tell me now yourself." "But suppose I will not tell you," murmured the unhappy woman. Muller bent forward and lowered his voice. "Then you know what my duty demands, if you will not speak." "What? What is your duty?" she asked, shivering. "It is my duty to tell the authorities that your son was in the Erlach house that night, and that you know of it." "Well, then? What will happen then?" "You will be arrested at once." "Why?" "You ask?" Mrs. Tunner covered her face with her hands and sat for a few moments in silence. Finally she spoke. "If I tell you all that I know, the only thing I know, must you then go to the authorities?" "No, for then I could take the responsibility about being silent for a while yet. I will then know by your own confession that your son was in the greenhouse that night, and no one else need know it for a while. And as yet I am the only person who knows it." You alone know it?" murmured Mrs. Tunner, slipping to her knees and holding out her hands, clasped in pleading. "And you will not say anything? Oh, I know you will not. And you won't force me to speak? Your heart is so good. You are too kind, too noble, to force a despairing mother to give up her only child in this way." "Then you will not speak?" No, I can't. "Very well, then I must do without your assistance." "Assistance? Did you really believe—" "I believe that you would talk to me freely. I believe that you yourself really do not know what happened that night, and therefore I cannot think that you, his mother, would believe the worst of your son." "But I do not." "You must, or else you would talk freely with me. You would do everything you can to clear him from this suspicion." "But I have cast no suspicion on him." "Yes, you have. You are doing it through your silence. You surely ought to know better than anyone else what might be expected of your son. You need not talk if you do not want to. I will follow up your son, and I will find him, for I usually find those I seek. You can go now if you want to. You can even leave my house if you desire it. You are not a prisoner here. But I warn you that as soon as you do go, it is my duty to tell the authorities, to let them know that you believe the worst of your son, that you know where he is, and that you will probably find some means to help him to a further flight, as you have already helped him to leave Vienna." "You know that too?" breathed Mrs. Tunner. "Yes, I know it. He thanks you for it himself." "You know that too?" she repeated, dazed. "Then you have—" "I opened your trunk. Yes, I did it. It was my duty, for I have been officially engaged to investigate the matter of Mr. Erlach's disappearance." "And what did you find out from my trunk?" the woman queried again in a tone of bitter contempt. "Only that you are a woman whose life has seen terrible reverses and great struggle and sorrow," replied Muller gravely. "Also that you have the misfortune to be the mother of a good-for-nothing son, who has already caused you great trouble and anxiety. But and that is the difference between us, I cannot yet believe the very worst of your son." "You can't? You can't? You don't believe, then, that he—" Her eyes softened, the tension in her face relaxed. "I did not find any evidence in his letters that he has passed beyond the stage of mere recklessness and selfish carelessness to a state of mind that would lead to murder. That does not come easily, even to a man who has sunk quite low. and I think that your son can still be saved." Mrs. Tunner sobbed aloud. She caught Muller's hand and pressed a passionate kiss on it. "Why, what are you doing?" he exclaimed, drawing away his hand. "Only what any mother would do, any mother whom a stranger must teach to trust her own son. Oh, how could I have ever thought it?" "I can understand," said the old detective gently. "You are a serious-minded woman, and your son's life thus far has been a terrible cross to you. When he came to you in that dreadful night, as he calls it, he may have come in great need, and you could not help him. He had to help himself somehow. In what way we do not know, but we know it must have been a wrong way. Into what it may have led him, what may have happened with or without his own will and intention, I do not know. You do not seem to know it either, but we both know that whatever it was, it drove him to flight. All that I ask of you now is to tell me what it was that he had wanted of you, according to his own letter. Your love for him is so strong that it leads you to exaggerate his faults, just as a great love leads some mothers to underestimate the lack in their children. I stand outside of the question altogether, and I think that I see more clearly than you do." Oh, I thank you for those words," sobbed the woman. "Yes, I can talk to you now, but only to you, for what I have to say may mean great danger for my boy. Karl came to me that evening to tell me that he had been in Vienna for several weeks, and that he had been trying in vain to find work. He told me that he had scarcely eaten anything for 2 days, and that he would have had to sleep in the parks had not a friend taken him in." Mrs. Tunner stopped and sank back again on the sofa, shivering. Muller went into the next room and returned with a glass of wine, which he offered her. She drank it and then continued her story in a hopeless, monotonous voice. "He asked me to help him, to give him money. All I had in the house was 4 crowns, which I had saved from my last salary. The rest, as usual, I had sent on the 1st of the month to Mrs. Menger, my former cook. She put it in the savings bank for me. Karl was not satisfied with the little I could give him. He was greatly excited and told me that a good position had been offered him, which he would lose if he couldn't raise a bond of 100 crowns at once. I had never seen him quite so upset before. It seemed to drive him nearly crazy when I told him that I couldn't possibly get the money under 3 or 4 days. You see, Mrs. Menger would have to give notice at the savings bank and then call for the money a day or 2 later." "How could Mrs. Menger get your money?" asked Muller. "She's taking care of it for me," replied Mrs. Tunner with a sad smile. "4 years ago, at the insistence of this good, faithful soul, I began to lay aside something for my old age. I had given Karl all my wages before that, but Katie Menger gave me no peace until I had started a savings bank account in her name, and promised to send her all I did not absolutely need just as soon as I received it. So now, if Karl came to ask for money a day or 2 after the 1st of the month, I never had any to give him. That night he was so angry that he lost his head completely. He made a demand of me, which I dismissed indignantly at once. It was so dreadful." "What was it?" "He demanded that I should ask Mr. Erlach for the money." "Well, that was nervy. Did he want you to drag the poor old man out of bed and force the money from him? Rather inconsiderate of him." "That was Karl's way," sighed Mrs. Tunner. "He never considered anyone else when he wanted anything. Even as a baby he expected to have his own will, always, at any cost." "This time, too?" Mrs. Tunner grew still paler at the question. "I don't know," she answered slowly, "for when Karl insisted and finally at my refusal declared that he would go in to see Mr. Erlach himself, if I was too much of a coward to do it, I lost my patience too, and sprang between him and the door, locking it. It was a terrible moment for me, for I almost hated my son then, but I was not yet afraid of him. I pushed him away, and I pointed to the other door, the door into the garden, and told him to go, ordered him to leave the house at once. He did so without another word for me. His face was pale and his step unsteady. When he had gone, I rushed to the door to call him back. That is, I wanted to rush to the door, but instead I fell in a faint. I do not know how long I lay there. I awoke to find myself on the kitchen floor, and it was some little while before I could remember what had happened. I ran to the back door and called his name out into the night, but the howling of the wind drowned my voice. I dragged myself back into the hall, locked the door, and went to bed. It was long before I could get to sleep, as you might well imagine. I awoke again at 5 o'clock. At 8 o'clock I discovered that Mr. Erlach was missing, and since then I have not known a quiet moment. Now I have told you all." The unfortunate woman fell back again into the sofa corner, her hands clasped in her lap. "Take some more of this wine," said Muller, "and now tell me something more. You say you do not know how long your faint lasted. Was there nothing to give you an idea of the time?" "No, nothing. I did not even look at the clock before I crept into bed." "And now tell me something of your last interview with your son." When she had obeyed his behest and somewhat controlled the stress of her emotion, Muller ordered his carriage, and they drove together to Mrs. Menger's flat. All they could find out here was that the letter received by Katie's sister from Karl Tunner had borne a Hungarian stamp. This seemed to suggest something to Mrs. Tunner, and Muller asked her what it was. "I think he must be in Pressburg," she said, apparently greatly relieved. Muller was much surprised. He stood for a moment motionless, then a faint smile curled his lips and shone in his keen eyes. He told Mrs. Menger to come to his house whenever she had any news that would interest Mrs. Tunner. Then he led the latter downstairs again to the waiting carriage. As they drove through the streets, Muller saw that his companion was much easier in her mind. The tension in her face relaxed, and the ghost of a smile appeared now and then on her pale lips. It was a long drive, and neither spoke until they were nearly home. Then Muller said gently, "What were you thinking of all this time, Mrs. Tunner?" She turned to him, her smile grown brighter, a look of hope in her eyes. "I am thinking of the crisis that this will mean for Karl, the crisis he must pass through if he is ever to be saved." "Then you will be satisfied with whatever I undertake, even if I find it necessary to arrest him?" "Yes, I am willing that you should do even that. It will be good for him. I no longer believe the worst of him, and if he has committed some minor fault, it is right and just that he should atone for it. It may be what he needs to make a decent man of him." "I think he can be saved," said Muller. "I begin to believe it, now that you think he is in Pressburg." "What has that got to do with it?" "It has a good deal to do with it. Do you believe that a man who has the worst to fear would go only as far as Pressburg?" "Oh." "What made you think of this city at once?" "Because his best friend lives there, a young man who is not much better than Karl," sighed the mother. "Bela von Lankowitz considers himself an artist, and therefore justified in living a reckless life. Karl mentioned recently that he is now engaged at the Pressburg Theater. His mother lives there. She too has been a widow for many years." "I'll go there myself today." "But if you don't find him there," said Mrs. Tunner hastily, "please don't think that it is my fault. The Hungarian stamp reminded me of Lankowitz. I know of no other friends of my son's there, nothing else that would take him into Hungary." "I understand that," said Muller. "I'll take the responsibility." They drove the rest of the way in silence. End of Chapter 5, Part 1. Chapter 5, Part 2 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Return of the Prodigal Son continued. Muller reached Pressburg that evening after midnight and went to a hotel at once. He was up again at 7 and walked over to the theater. The bills for the performance of the day before were still hanging on the boards, and an attendant came out to change them as the detective stood there. "This is the bill for today, sir," said the man. "That's what we gave yesterday." Muller inquired about Mr. von Lankowitz, and the attendant shrugged his shoulders with a smile. "Oh, he never gets his name on the bill," he said. "He sings along with the rest of them in the chorus." A silver piece pressed into the man's hand brought forth the necessary information regarding the address of the young chorus singer. As it was at a considerable distance from the theater, Muller set out in spite of the early hour. The number he sought was in a new street of cheap tenements, where the outer wall of the houses, newly erected as they were, was already cracking and peeling off. The interior, the halls, and the many stairways were equally unattractive. Finally, after many inquiries, Muller found the apartment he sought. As he stopped in front of the door, he could look through its little glass peephole into an untidy kitchen, about the walls of which women's garments were hanging. The whole look of the place, as far as he could see, told him that even if the two young men were alike in character, This mother was very different from Mrs. Tunner. On the door were 2 visiting cards decorated with a crest of arms and a crown. On the one card stood the name Henrietta Amalie Lankowitz, des Ober et Erdoffelve. Underneath was written in ink, lessons in dancing and deportment. The other card showed the name of the young Lankowitz. The writing on the first card gave Muller the excuse that he needed to enter the apartment, and he pressed the button at once. He had to wait some time. Finally he heard steps coming to the door from another direction, and it was opened a tiny crack. "What do you want?" said a small plump woman, whose untidy gray head showed in the opening. "I would like to speak to Mrs. von Lankowitz." "I am Mrs. von Lankowitz." Muller excused his early coming by saying that he was busy the rest of the day, but that he wanted to speak about dancing lessons for his nieces. This won the confidence of the woman on the other side of the door, and she asked him to come in. Inside, in an untidy room, he saw that she was at least 60, short and fat. Her face, swollen and puffy, was already thickly powdered, although her hair had not yet been combed. She wore a torn and faded dressing gown, and the whole look of the woman was unattractive in the extreme. But Muller controlled his first feeling of repulsion, and soon discovered that the poor old creature was half crazy and quite harmless in her foolish vanity. His kindness and gentle flattery won her heart, and she told him all he wanted to know. Her son had a friend staying with him, she said, a nervous young man who seemed to be uneasy all the time, who only came Sunday evening, and was now going away again that very day. At the present moment the young gentlemen were out on an excursion, just where the old lady did not know. She did know, however, that the friend, who had been introduced to her as Karl Tunner, intended to leave Pressburg by the 6 o'clock train. When Muller had learned all this, he took his farewell, promising that Mrs. von Lankowitz should hear from him the very next day regarding the lessons. The detective was glad to escape into the pure air outside, and as he had nothing to do, he spent the rest of the day in the charming surroundings of the city. An hour before train time, he went to the station, took his ticket, ordered a compartment reserved for him, and then strolled about, apparently careless, but in reality watching every young man who passed him. He was quite calm and collected. There was not a sign of excitement about him. The experienced detective had by this time made up his mind that Leopold Erlach had been murdered and his body hidden somewhere. But since the last evening he no longer considered Karl Tunner as the possible criminal, for in his mind a crime such as he now believed to have been committed needed careful, cold-blooded preparation and a nerve and self-control of which this young vagabond would hardly be in possession. It would have been quite impossible for him to have carried out the crime unless his mother were in league with him, and this, Muller now knew, was not the case. With his knowledge of human nature, he realized the honesty and uprightness of the woman's character. The boy was a good-for-nothing. He was lazy, he might be a thief, possibly, but he could not be a murderer, not yet, at least. Muller was honest with himself also, and he indulged in a quiet laugh at his own expense just now. Before he took the train for Pressburg the evening of the day previous, he had known perfectly well that Karl Tunner had nothing to do with the murder, and yet he devoted 24 hours to finding the young scapegrace and bringing him home to his mother. And he did it for no other reason than the fact that he felt sorry for this mother, and that she at least seemed worth a little time and money spent in the rescue of her boy. It was one of the little digressions that he could not help, and he excused it to himself by saying that from the next morning on he would devote all his energy to the Erlach case. The time passed finally, and about 10 minutes before the departure of the train, 2 young men came in hastily in earnest conversation. They parted just inside the door, and the taller of the 2 hurried to the ticket office. Muller, who followed close behind, heard him ask for a third-class ticket to Vienna. There was no third class on the express, so the young man was obliged to go second. When he had his ticket, he hurried out to the platform, Muller still following. The detective motioned to the waiting conductor, and the official helped the young man into the compartment that Muller had reserved. The latter got in himself, and a moment later the train started. "Good afternoon, Mr. Tunner," began Muller, when they were well on their way. Karl Tunner sprang from his seat, then sank back again, stammering inarticulately. "You want to know who I am?" asked Muller with a smile. "I am a man who has come to find you and take you home. I am a detective." Did that fool Stillinger give me away when there was no need for it, or have they arrested him again?" Muller was surprised, but now he knew why Karl Tunner left Vienna. "Don't be angry," he said. "You ought to have known that you couldn't depend on Stillinger." "But it was he who told me to stand watch." "Even then you didn't have to do it." "Did you ever go a whole week without anything to eat?" "No, I'm not afraid of work." Karl Tunner's eyes dropped. "I was coming home," he said after a pause. "I wanted to come back and be a decent man again. I was coming back to see my mother, but I won't be able to do it now. I won't be able to ask her to forgive me. I never thought that I'd be arrested now. Oh, my poor mother will never outlive it." "But you will, all right." "Oh, don't make fun of me. Haven't you got a heart?" "About as much as you have, to judge by your conduct towards your mother." "Oh, I'm a good-for-nothing. I know it. But how do you know so much about me? Have the police been watching me?" "They've naturally been looking up your record." "On account of that little fool thing? Stillinger sent me word that the man wasn't really hurt. Why did they arrest him again, then? And why did you follow me here?" "See here, young friend, you'd better not be asking so many questions. Leave that to me." "Very well, then. But I don't have to answer you, do I?" "Oh ho, we're defiant, are we? That will only make things worse for you. The best thing for you to do is to stick severely to the truth. Then you won't mix yourself up in what you say and set the judge against you." "The judge? Are they going to bring me to trial?" "Why, of course. They want to find out about the other matter, the more important one." "What other matter? What do you mean?" "I mean what happened in the Erlach house." "What happened there?" Tunner's voice was full of defiance. "I told my mother she ought to ask Mr. Erlach for money, if you want to know. I don't know why that should interest the police. She didn't do it anyway. She turned me out of the house and—" "And then she fainted and lay there unconscious ever so long. The next morning Mr. Erlach had disappeared and has not been found since." Karl Tunner stared at the man opposite him as if dazed. It was clear that he did not understand the matter at all at first. But as the comprehension came to him, he screamed aloud and sprang up. He stood before Muller, his face white, his big blue eyes full of horror, trembling in every fiber, and stretched out his hand as if pleading for mercy. "Then that was what she meant," he groaned. "That! She even believes me capable of murder? That was what she meant. And I didn't dare tell her that it wasn't true, because just a few days before I'd helped to knock a man senseless and rob him." The poor boy sank back in his seat, trembling all over. Muller looked at him pityingly, although his mind was busy with the question, "Who then is the unknown murderer, and where must I seek him?" It was some time before Karl Tunner could control himself. Finally he began to speak again. "You say that Mr. Erlach disappeared that night?" "Yes, that was what I said." "And in my excitement I imagined, of course, that he must have been murdered and buried somewhere." "You may possibly be right about that." "Possibly? Don't they know?" "No, nothing has been discovered." "Why did they think of me? I hadn't anything against the old man. I never even saw him." "Robbery may have been the motive for the murder. It is known that you were with your mother that evening after Erlach had gone to bed." Young Tunner clenched his teeth and groaned aloud as Muller continued calmly. "We know your past career. We know that you are idle and disinclined to work. We know that you are pleasure-loving and unscrupulous with but a very poor idea of duty or consideration for others. It's easy enough to be led into murder when one is determined to get money at any cost. You confess to the other matter. Might it not have been the same with Erlach? He was an old man, not strong. It would have taken little to finish him, especially when he had been awakened from sleep." "Who says he was asleep while I was in the house?" interrupted Karl. "What do you know about it?" "I know there was a light in his room, not a nightlight, a regular lamp." "Did your mother know that?" "No, I didn't tell her. She thought he was asleep." "It would be difficult for you to convince people that you could climb that wall without help." "So they know I came in over the wall, do they?" said Karl bitterly. "And they think I must have brought an accomplice with me. Do they believe that my mother—" "No, they do not," said Muller quickly. "Your mother's life would give the lie to any suspicions." Karl's head sank on his breast. After a while he spoke slowly and grimly. "Yes, Stillinger was with me, but he stayed outside the wall. It was he who drove me to do it, to go to my mother that evening, and he waited outside for me." "Why did you want 100 crowns? Of course, I don't believe the story of the position and the bond, but I certainly don't think you're bad enough to frighten your mother to that extent, just because that rascal Stillinger demanded it of you." Again Karl paused a moment before he spoke. "Well, I suppose you'll have to know that too. I had a position as errand boy with a tailor, and he gave me an overcoat to take to the furrier. I pawned the coat, and Stillinger and I used up the 50 crowns it brought me. Of course it was found out. On the 8th of September it was. The tailor found the pawn ticket and told me he'd give me 2 days to return the money. I was living with Stillinger then, and of course I told him the story. He said to go to my mother about it. And you asked her for 100 crowns? Man alive, isn't there any limit to your heartlessness and your impudence? Karl Tunner's head sank again. In spite of his show of bravado, he was only half-heartedly a rascal. Meekly he endured all this scolding at the hands of a man who, although Karl did not know it, had no authority for the position he took. But it was one of Muller's characteristics that he invariably knew the right time to say a thing. It was this that gave him his power to touch the heart of even the most abandoned criminal. His present task was an easy one. Karl Tunner had reached the crisis which comes to all at some time or other, the moment when the natural good hidden down deep in the boy's heart began to assert itself in a wave of disgust at the life he was leading. For in spite of his selfishness and laziness, Karl was not really bad at heart. He had a hidden fund of inherited good qualities to fall back upon, and the crisis of emotion through which he was now passing had served to bring it out. He bared his soul piteously to this utter stranger, as a sort of penance for his misdoing. "And when your mother couldn't give you the money, what did you do then?" inquired the detective. "Stillinger and I spent all day making plans. Finally, we decided to try the hold-up. Do you want me to tell you about that?" "No, you needn't. I know about it." Muller had read the police account of the farmer coming into market in the early morning hours and being held up by a young man by the name of Stillinger, who was known to be an assistant at the city market. In spite of the victim's intoxication, he had managed to call for help, and Stillinger was arrested. His accomplice, who had stood sentry, escaped. Muller was now the first to know that Karl Tunner had been this accomplice. The victim of the holdup had not been injured at all, and the prisoner protested that it was a misunderstanding. Therefore he was released after 2 or 3 days. Muller continued his questioning. "How did you know that your mother had left Inzersdorf?" "She wrote to me." "But she told you nothing about Mr. Erlach's disappearance? And you didn't see it in the papers?" "I don't often get a chance to read a paper, and since I've had so much trouble, I haven't taken any interest in anything. I look over the advertisements in the Crown Gazette. That is, I've done so since the 12th of September. "Oh, I see," smiled Muller. "That was how you knew it was safe for you to come back. An arrangement with Stillinger, eh?" "Sure. He let me know it was all right, and I wanted to come back to give my mother the rest of the money, to tell her everything." "And to promise her you'd turn over a new leaf?" The detective's tone was slightly sarcastic. Karl looked at him pleadingly and answered, "I really want to do it this time. Will I be allowed to see my mother? Soon? Real soon? If she's got to live through this disgrace, at least I want her to know that I'm not a murderer." The young man burst into tears, and Muller let the crisis of his emotion pass without interruption. When Karl had controlled himself again, he said, "And when I serve my term, when they let me out again, will you let me hunt for Erlach's murderer? If they haven't found him till then, I'll find him." A smile and a quick look of interest illumined Muller's face. "That's not a bad idea," he said after a moment. "How much schooling have you had?" "Normal school and a business school." "And yet you've never been able to accomplish anything?" I didn't half try, I'm afraid." "Do you know any foreign languages?" "I can speak French. My mother speaks it just as she does German, and we always spoke it at home when I was a child. I kept it up ever since." "That might come in handy," said Muller thoughtfully. After this they both relapsed into silence. Karl did not say another word even when the station was reached. He followed Muller quietly into the cab and sat cowering in the corner as they drove through the lighted streets. Supposing that he was being driven to prison, he paid no attention to his surroundings. Mechanically he alighted when the carriage stopped and followed the detective into the house and into a room on the ground floor. It was a comfortable, warm, and well-lit room, but the unhappy boy did not notice it. He sank into a chair and covered his face with his hands. "And I've come down to this," he thought, "but no one will pity me, for I've deserved it." He sat there for some time until he heard steps outside and the door opened softly. Even then he didn't dare look up. "Now they're coming after me to take me to the cell," he thought. Finally, as no one spoke, he mustered up courage to raise his head, looking toward the now open door. With a cry, he sprang up, ran forward, and fell on his knees at the feet of the woman who stood there. "Mother, oh mother," he sobbed. End of Chapter 5, Part 2. Chapter 6 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. What Stillinger Saw on the Black Moor. That same evening, while Muller and Karl Tunner were making the journey from Pressburg to Vienna, Lieutenant Paul Erlach sat by the side of Miss Nellie von Feldern in a cozy drawing-room, bright with lights and flowers. There had been no definite word spoken between the young people, but they themselves were as little in doubt as to their feelings for one another as was the rest of the family gathering that filled the adjoining rooms of the Feldern home. Paul was poor, and Nellie's father, the retired Colonel von Feldern, had suffered financial reverses owing to his generosity in shouldering a comrade's debt. Neither of the young people could raise the sum of money required by the Austrian military authorities as a first condition for consent to the marriage of an army officer. Paul was a man of sensitive mind and high ideals of honor. He would not consent to bind the girl to him thus hopelessly. But the renunciation cost him many an hour of suffering. It seemed doubly hard this evening. With her grave, sweet beauty enhanced by a simple and becoming evening gown, with the pretty flush on her soft cheeks that betrayed her happiness in thus having him at her side, Nellie had never seemed so lovable, so desirable. Apart from the one absorbing topic of his affection for her, there was something else in Paul's mind that night, something he wanted to speak to Nellie about. But he could not find courage to broach the subject. When they had sat silent for some time, Nellie said, "You asked me to leave the others and come in here because you had something to say to me. What is it?" "It's difficult for me to say it," said Paul, "but the matter is important, very important for me." "Don't be afraid to talk," said Nellie gently. "You know I'm always glad to hear anything you have to say." Without answering, Paul handed her the anonymous letter. She read it, then turned to him in surprise. "Is this what was worrying you?" she asked. "I don't understand. And why? Why did you want me to read it?" Nellie's voice trembled, the lids drooped over her eyes, and the color came and went on her soft cheeks. "It doesn't worry me as much as it did at first," said the young officer. "I can think about it more calmly now, and it is you, just you, who must read this letter, Miss Nellie. This about the father-in-law, don't you understand? It means your father." "Oh." "At least I am forced to think it does, because yours is the only house to which I have come with any frequency at all. But believe me, Miss Nellie, never with any word or hint have I suggested that I might be so fortunate." Paul stopped, unable to find the words in his eagerness. The girl looked at him gravely. "You need not tell me this. I know it. I trust you." Thank you. And now may I bother you with a few questions?" "Certainly." "Does this handwriting remind you of any you might have seen at any time?" He handed her the letter again. She looked at it carefully. "It's a disguised hand, I suppose. It doesn't seem to remind me of anyone." "It must have been written by someone who knows you, and who envies me the happiness which he believes, without any justification, to be mine. It must have been written by someone who hates me because he loves you." "A nice sort of love, that." "Every man loves as his nature is." "This man loves more like a villain, then, if you do not mistake the motive of this letter." "I cannot understand any other motive for it." "Well, then," said Nellie, settling back in her sofa corner, "let us go at the matter in a business-like way. Now, the number of those who might have written such a letter from such a motive is not as great as you seem to think. In Linz, for instance, there were only 2 suitors. One was Captain von Schlemm, and the other was a lawyer, Mr. Stoger. They're both happily married now, you know, and therefore need not come in for consideration." "No, indeed, I know both these men. They are not capable of an action of this sort. But can't you remember someone else? Someone who might never have come sufficiently into the horizon of your life to be called an official suitor, but someone who loved you, at a distance, for instance?" "I hate to ask all these things, Miss Nellie, but my friend Commissioner Lair and the detective who is in charge of the case concerning my uncle believe that this letter might have something to do with it, and they are very anxious to find some clue to the writer." "Why, certainly. I don't exactly see how this letter could have anything to do with your uncle's disappearance, but I'll gladly do all I can to help you." Now, for instance, at the present moment, I don't have to think very far. I don't know of anybody at all. Now, Miss Nellie, why, I could name two, besides my own self. One of them is in the other room now. There he stands talking to your father, and probably wishing me in the farthest corner of the earth. Nellie laughed brightly. You mean Mr. Cress? Oh, he's such a decent sort, even if he has a red beard. You surely don't think that he— Certainly not. No more do I think it of my comrade Lauren, who's now up in the mountains of Hungary. But there must be someone else. A man doesn't need to have said anything to a woman, and yet somehow she understands that he is in love with her. Can't you remember any such secret admirer? Oh, yes, there is someone. He sends me flowers anonymously. Indeed. And poems, too. Have you any of them? Asked Paul eagerly. No, I'm sorry now. What happened to them? I burned them. I didn't like the tone of them. It was too passionate. It wasn't nice. Altogether, I received about 6 or 7 of these bunches of flowers, each time with a poem. I sent the flowers to the hospital. I read only 2 of the poems. The others I burned without reading them. That's too bad. Did that happen in Linz, too? No, that began in Muller, you know, the little village outside Vienna, where we lived for nearly a year. 2 years ago, then. And you never heard any more from this admirer? Why, I don't know. I get flowers occasionally. Perhaps they're from him, but he doesn't send any more of the poems. How did these things come to you? When we were in the country, they came with the parcels post from Vienna. Here, they're brought by a messenger. Now, may I ask where you lived in Muller? Did you have a house of your own there? No, we rented a larger part of a house from a Mrs. von Probst. She owned the house and also a very unpleasant son. He was one of those conceited individuals, although goodness knows he had no right to be, for the only thing noticeable about him was his ugliness. I suppose he tried to attract your attention? No more than he did that of everybody else. But I shouldn't talk so about him. The poor fellow can't help being ugly. In spite of his conceit, he was not very aggressive, and they said that he was honest and very capable, too. And you can't remember anything else? Nothing at all that would give us a clue to the writer of this letter? No, nothing at all. Then you've engaged a detective about your uncle? Yes, a very good one, they tell me. And yet nothing's been discovered? No word of your uncle? Or of his death? No, nothing. This detective has only just taken up the case, you know. I am sure no one could wish to have light brought into this mystery more than I do. Paul sighed deeply, and an answering sigh came from the girl beside him. Then they both blushed, and did not dare to look at each other for the moment, for the same thought had passed through the mind of each, the thought of what definite news of Leopold Erlach's death would mean to them. Nellie bent her head deeper over the fragrant mass of violets that filled the glass bowl on the table. They were Paul's gift, while the great bunch of glowing roses that stood near had been brought by Mr. Cress, the rich merchant who now stood in the other room, talking to the colonel, but glancing impatiently towards the corner where the young couple sat. There was a heavy silence between the two, full of unspoken emotion. Finally, Paul said slowly and gravely, Miss Nellie, you're working too hard at your studies. You are so pale. I don't half believe that you have the strength to stand the strain of teaching. If I dare give you any advice at all, it will be to prefer those roses. It is now the 13th day since my uncle's disappearance, and there has been no sign of him, living or dead. If it cannot be proven that he is alive or dead, we know what that means. Why, Miss Nellie, Nellie, what are you doing? Nellie had arisen from her seat, taken the vase with the roses, and carried it away to set on a cabinet at the other end of the room. Then she came back to the sofa. What are you doing? What have you done? He asked again. The only thing I could do, said the girl gently, her cheeks a soft rose as he bent to kiss her hand. I prefer violets. The morning after his return from Pressburg, Muller made an early call on Johann Stillinger, Karl's accomplice of the attempted robbery. He had the address from the police and walked into the young man's room without much ceremony. You are Johann Stillinger? The detective said. And who are you? Asked the man who sat at the table, a true type of bully of the tenement districts. I'm a police agent. Stillinger said nothing for a moment. He'd had so much to do with the police recently that he judged silence to be his best policy. He continued to drink his morning coffee as if the matter didn't concern him at all, but it did not escape Muller's notice that the spoon shook in his hand. The detective sat down on the only other chair in the bare little room and began comfortably. Don't let your coffee get cold. I just want you to tell me a little more about that holdup last week. Now, Carl Tunner—" Stillinger jumped up, dropping his spoon on the floor. "Has that fool been talking? That damn idiot?" he screamed. "Just wait till I settle him, when I get out again." "Do be quiet. You'll alarm the whole house, and besides, nobody's locked you up yet." "What do you mean by that?" "Merely a hint that I haven't come to arrest you. In fact, I haven't any warrant to do it." Johann Stillinger looked at his visitor in surprise. "Then what did you come for?" he asked, sitting down again. "I'll tell you." "Hurry up about it." "I'll take my own time, please. First of all, I have a suggestion. Suppose you take a position with the street cleaning department." Stillinger shook his head and asked ironically, "Now where'd you get that idea?" "It's not such a bad idea. They're not likely to take you on again at the market. And I suppose you haven't learned any trade, or you wouldn't have been in that work. It won't be easy for you to get work by your own efforts now, and I don't suppose you're particularly anxious to come down in the world any more than you have. Am I right about this?" "Guess you might be. I ain't hankering after having anything more to do with the police." "Well, then, you've got to work if you want to avoid the police, and you can have a position at street cleaning if you want it." "But see here, there's something queer about this, that you're so anxious to help me. Where's the hook?" "I want you to do something for me, and I don't want you to do it without payment. I can't get you a position at court, but I can arrange for your employment in the street cleaning department. I'm willing to do that for what I want of you. I don't see any particular good in putting you in prison again, although you did get free a little too easy this time. You might as well have a try at leading a decent life. Therefore, I'm not troubling my conscience about keeping silent on what—" "On what that damned idiot told you?" interrupted Stillinger angrily. Muller pushed him back in the chair again. "Go easy now. Tunner told me the truth about the matter without any intention to injure you at all. I'll explain to you later how it was. Now I have a question. Did you spend a part of the night of the 9th of September in the neighborhood of Inzersdorf?" "Yes. Well, suppose I did. What were you doing out there?" "I went out with Carl. He was going to his mother. What did he want at that hour of night?" "He wanted money. He had to have it next morning. If he didn't get the 50 crowns, they'd lock him up." "But he asked for 100. "Oh, you know that, do you? Then what do you ask me about it?" Muller looked straight at the man, and the bully's eyes sank. "It was you who got him to do that," said the detective calmly, "and you went with him to be sure he wouldn't turn back at the last moment." "Yes, that's true. Carl's a weak sort of chap. He's sure the kind that turns back at the last minute." "I shouldn't call a man a coward merely because he hasn't the courage to do an evil thing. Now I want you to tell me exactly what happened that night." "Well, if you're know-it-all, why should I tell you about it?" "You will do as I tell you, and do it right now." "All right, then. Well, we went out to the country, and it was pretty late. I heard it strike 11 in Inzersdorf when Carl climbed over the wall. I walked up and down, then I stood by a tree, a poplar tree it was, at the edge of the meadow. That's how we'd arranged it. I waited, and it was the longest time before I heard anything movin'. Nothin' but just the wind. Then I hear something movin' in the avenue, under the row of trees that goes out from the garden to the high road. But there was such a mist on the moor that the moon didn't help yer to see much. All I knew was that what was movin' under the trees wasn't comin' from the same place where Carl climbed over the wall. So I thinks she saved him the trouble and opened the gate for him. Then I calls to him 2 or 3 times, 'cause I thinks he's forgotten where he was to meet. He was goin' in the opposite direction from my tree. When I shouted, there wasn't a sound in the avenue. I called again, but there was nothin' happened. Then I hears the dry leaves in the avenue making a noise, as if somebody was walking very quick, and I calls again. Then way off in the fog I see a man's figure, only just for a minute, and I don't see him very distinctly. Then he's gone again. I yelled after him, and suddenly I hears Carl behind me saying to me, 'What are you yelling so for, you fool?' There he was, come over the wall, just where he'd gone in. I asked him for the money, and he tells me, very mad, that he couldn't get it. So we comes back here, and then I thinks out the hold-up." Stillinger stopped and sat looking at the detective in astonishment. Muller was evidently greatly interested by the man's story. He sat leaning forward in his chair, his lips firmly set, his eyes sharp as steel, and his face pale in excitement. Finally he breathed deeply and leaned back more comfortably. Then, after a pause, he asked, "Then you saw the man only very indistinctly?" "Yes, just dim like in the fog." "Was there anything you particularly noticed about him?" "No, or yes. He seemed pretty big, but perhaps that was only the fog." "Yes, that's possible. Did he seem to be carrying anything?" "No." "Or were there 2 of them?" "No, there wasn't but one." Do you think that if we stood under the poplar tree, you could show me the direction the man took?" Now Stillinger became interested himself. "Is that so important?" he said. Muller replied sharply, "Answer my question." "Sure, I think I could tell yer." "Very well. 6 o'clock this evening you are to meet me in front of the church of St. Roch. I'll have a carriage there, and we'll drive out to Inzersdorf." "I'll be there," said Stillinger. "But why is all that so important?" Muller stood up and took his hat. "I suppose you never read the papers," he said. "I get a blink at one occasionally, when I have the cash for a glass of beer in the café." "Well, you don't miss much, and the matter concerned here probably wouldn't interest you, so you needn't ask any more about it. Be there on time, and now, goodbye." The detective was already at the door when Stillinger called to him. "But you want me to do something for you. You ain't getting me a position for nothing?" Muller laughed. "You've done it already, or nearly so." "What?" "You told me a story which I think will be of great value to me." "Is that all?" asked the man, astonished. "And then you'll take a drive with me this evening." "And you're going to get me a place for that?" "Yes, and a chance to be a decent man. You're in luck, young friend, but I don't know as I'm doing it so much for you as for all those to whom you might be dangerous if you keep on as you are now." Another nod, and Muller was outside the door. He had gone to see Stillinger simply so as not to reproach himself for having neglected any possible clue. Since Carl Tunner told him that Stillinger had waited outside the greenhouse that evening, Muller knew it would be wise to find the man and question him, for he might have seen something during his vigil. But experienced detective as he was, Muller never imagined he was going to get as much out of this visit as he really did. Stillinger had undoubtedly seen either Erlach's murderer or Erlach himself, probably the former, for unless the old gentleman had suddenly lost his senses, it was not at all likely that he should have voluntarily gone into hiding and remained absent so long. But if the figure seen through the fog was Erlach's murderer, where was the old man himself? According to Stillinger's report, the man he had seen had not been carrying a burden, and he had been quite certain that there were not two of them. Therefore, it could not be a case of kidnapping, as Muller had thought might be possible. The mystery deepened the more he went into it, and Muller's interest grew with the growing difficulty of the case. His carriage stopped in front of the church at exactly 6 o'clock, and he found Stillinger waiting for him. They drove out into the country at a sharp pace, and reached the poplar tree by the wayside just as twilight was falling. Muller let his wagon wait for him at some little distance. The poplar tree lay about 50 paces from the garden wall, and about an equal distance from the end of the avenue of trees. "Over there's where I see him disappear," said Stillinger, pointing towards the southwest, where another avenue of very old trees cut off the horizon line. "Was it lighter then than it is now?" asked Muller. "You said the moon was shining?" Stillinger shook his head. "Yes, but there was a fog. If you want to know how far you could see that night, you'll have to wait a bit." "All right, we'll wait a bit." The black moor on the edge of which the two watchers stood was a low-lying, almost treeless waste, already veiled in twilight and in the fluttering ragged ends of mist that rose from it in spots. In the direction to which Stillinger pointed there were several roads, leading various ways. "Did the man change his direction after you called to him?" asked the detective. Stillinger did not think that this was the case. Then they stood in silence for some time, till finally the younger man said, "There now, this is about what it was like that night. You couldn't scarce see the trees in the avenue one from another. Sir, you see, I couldn't get more than just a squint of him. I'll go over there, and then you can see how it was." He ran out into the gloom. Muller watched him disappearing into the avenue of trees, heard the leaves rustle under his feet, and saw him come out again at the other end. Stillinger ran on for some few yards in the direction in which he had pointed, and Muller could see him most of the time. But he knew that on the night in question there had been very much more of a fog, and the air was not nearly as clear. This rendered it much more difficult to estimate the distance and size of any object. Muller returned to Vienna with Stillinger, leaving the latter at the church where he had found him. "Go to the main office of the street cleaning department tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock, were the detective's parting words. "They know that you are coming, and your position is assured." And the young man, who now drops out of the story, did really enter the service of the street cleaning department, and led a more or less decent life. This was just one of the many good things that Muller did, so quietly and unassumingly that few people heard of them. End of chapter 6.